Good evening, peeps. You got me my phone. Nice. And we're at 40%. Okay. We are going to be continuing The Chronicles of Narnia by C.S. Lewis. We finished The Magician's Nephew last week, and we will be starting The Lion and the Witch and the Wardrobe. I'm going to read the excerpt at the beginning because I thought it was really sweet. To Lucy Barfield. My dear Lucy, I wrote this story for you, but when I began it, I had not realized that girls grow quicker than books. As a result, you are already too old for fairy tales, and by the time it is printed and bound, you will be older still. But someday, you will be old enough to start reading fairy tales again. You can then take it down from some upper shelf, dust it, and tell me what you think of it. I shall probably be too deaf to hear and too old to understand a word you say, but I shall still be your affectionate godfather. I'm sorry, that was super sweet. So this would have been the first book he actually wrote. Okay. Chapter 1. Lucy Looks into a Wardrobe. Once, there were 4 children whose names were Peter, Susan, Edmund, and Lucy. This story is about something that happened to them when they were sent away from London during the war because of the air raids. They were sent to the house of an old professor who lived in the heart of the country, 10 miles from the nearest railway station and 2 miles from the nearest post office. He had no wife, and he lived in a very large house with a housekeeper called Mrs. Macready. Wait, is this is the magician professor? Like, this guy, old yeah. So he never did marry Diggory, right. So he never married, Polly?
They were very good friends, is what it said.
Aw. I was hoping they'd get together, sorry. Old professor who lived in the heart of the country, 10 miles. He had no wife, and he lived in a very large house with a housekeeper called Mrs. Macready and 3 servants. Their names were Ivy, Margaret, and Betty, but they do not come into the story much. He himself was a very old man, with shaggy white hair which grew over most of his face as well as on his head, and they liked him almost at once. But on the first evening, when he came out to meet them at the front door, he was so odd-looking that Lucy, who was the youngest, was a little afraid of him, and Edmund, who was the next youngest, wanted to laugh and had to keep on pretending he was blowing his nose to hide it. As soon as they had said good-night to the professor and gone upstairs on the first night, the boys came into the girls' room and they all talked it over. We've fallen on our feet with no mistake. We've fallen on our feet, and no mistake, said Peter. This is going to be perfectly splendid. That old chap will let us do anything we like. I think he's an old dear, said Susan. Oh, come off it, said Edmund, who was tired and pretending not to be tired, which always made him bad-tempered. Don't go on talking like that. Like what? Said Susan. And anyway, it's time you were in bed. Trying to talk like mother, said Edmund. And who are you to say when I'm to go to bed? Go to bed yourself. Hadn't we all better go to bed? Said Lucy. There's sure to be a row if we're heard talking here. No, there won't, said Peter. I tell you that this sort of house where no one's going to get I tell you this is the sort of house where no one's going to mind what we do. Anyway, they won't hear us. It's about 10 minutes' walk from here down to that dining room, and any amount of stairs and passages in between. What's that noise? Said Lucy suddenly. It was a far larger house than she had ever been in before, and she thought all of those long passageways and rows of doors leading into empty rooms was beginning to make her feel a little creepy. Only a bird, silly, said Edmund. It's an owl, said Peter. This is going to be a wonderful place for birds. I shall go to bed now, I say. Let's go and explore tomorrow. You might find anything in a place like this. Did you see those mountains as we came along, and the woods? There might be eagles, there might be stags, there'll be hawks. Badgers, said Lucy. Foxes, said Edmund. Rabbits, said Susan. But when the next morning came, there was a steady rain falling, so thick that when you looked out the window you could neither see the mountains nor the woods nor even the stream in the garden. Of course it would be raining, said Edmund. They had just finished their breakfast with the professor, and were upstairs in the room he had set apart for them, a long, low room with 2 windows looking out in one direction and 2 in the other. Stop grumbling, Ed, said Susan. 10 to 1 it'll clear up in an hour or so, and in the meantime we're pretty well off. There's a wireless and lots of books. Not for me, said Peter. I'm going to explore the house. Everyone agreed to this, and that was how this adventure began. It was the sort of house that you never seemed to come to the end of, and it was full of unexpected places. The first few dozen they tried only led into spare bedrooms as everyone had expected they would, but soon they came to a very long room full of pictures, and there they found a suit of armor. And after that, there was a room all hung with green, with a harp in one corner. And then there came 3 steps down and 5 steps up, and then a kind of little upstairs hall, and a door that led out to a balcony, and then a whole series of rooms that led into each other and were lined with books, most of them very old books, and some bigger than a Bible in a church. And shortly after that, they looked into a room that was quite empty except for one big wardrobe, the sort that had a looking glass in the door. There was nothing else in the room at all except a dead blue bottle on the windowsill. "Nothing there," said Peter, and they all trooped out again, all except Lucy. She stayed behind because she thought it would be worthwhile trying the door of the wardrobe, even though she felt almost sure that it would be locked. To her surprise, it opened quite easily, and 2 mothballs dropped out. Looking into the inside, she saw several coats hanging up, mostly long fur coats. There was nothing Lucy liked so much as the smell and feel of fur. She immediately stepped into the wardrobe and got in amongst the coats and rubbed her face against them, leaving the door open, of course, because she knew that it was very foolish to shut oneself into any wardrobe. Soon she went farther in and found that there was a second row of coats hanging up behind the first one. It was almost quite dark in there, and she kept her arms stretched out in front of her so as not to bump her face into the back of the wardrobe. She took a step farther in, then 2 or 3 steps, always expecting to feel the woodwork against the tips of her fingers, but she could not feel it. "This must be a simply enormous wardrobe," thought Lucy, going still farther in and pushing the soft folds of the coats aside to make room for her. Then she noticed that there was something crunching under her feet. "I wonder if that's more mothballs," she thought, stooping down to feel it with her hand. But instead of feeling the hard, smooth wood of the floor of the wardrobe, she felt something soft and powdery and extremely cold. "This is very queer," she said, and went on a step or 2 further. Next moment, she found that she was rubbing against her face. The next moment, she found that what was rubbing against her face and hands was no longer soft fur, but something hard and rough, and even prickly. "Why, it's just like branches of a tree!" exclaimed Lucy, and then she saw that there was a light ahead of her, not a few inches away where the backs of the wardrobe ought to be, but a long way off. Something cold and soft was falling on her. A moment later, she found that she was standing in the middle of a wood at night time, with snow under her feet and snowflakes falling through the air. Lucy felt a little frightened, but she felt very inquisitive and excited as well. She looked back over her shoulder, and there, between the dark tree trunks, she could see the open doorway of the wardrobe, and even catch a glimpse of the empty room from which she had set out. She had, of course, left the door open, for she knew it was a very silly thing to shut oneself into a wardrobe. It seemed to still be daylight there. "I can always get back if anything goes wrong," thought Lucy. She began to walk forwards, crunch, crunch, over the snow and through the wood towards the other light. In about 10 minutes she reached it, and found it was a lamp post. As she stood looking at it, wondering why there was a lamp post in the middle of a wood, and wondering what to do next, she heard a pitter-patter of feet coming toward her. And soon after, a very strange person stepped out from among the trees into the light of the lamp post. He was only a little taller than Lucy herself, and he carried over his head an umbrella, white with snow. From the waist upwards he was like a man, but his legs were shaped like a goat's. The hair on them was glossy black, and instead of feet, he had goat's hooves. He also had a tail, but Lucy did not notice this at first because it was nearly caught up over the arm that held the umbrella so as to keep it from trailing in the snow. He had a red woolen muffler around his neck, and his skin was rather reddish too. He had a strange but pleasant little face, with a short pointed beard and curly hair, and out of the hair there stuck 2 horns, one on each side of his forehead. One of his hands, as I have said, held the umbrella. In the other arm he carried several brown paper parcels. What with the parcels and the snow, it looked just as if he had been doing his Christmas shopping. He was a faun, and when he saw Lucy, he gave such a start of surprise that he dropped all of his parcels. "Goodness gracious me!" exclaimed the faun. What Lucy found there, Chapter 2. Good evening, said Lucy, but the fawn was so busy picking up his parcels that at first it did not reply. When it had finished, it made her a little bow. Good evening, said the fawn. Excuse me, I don't want to be inquisitive, but should I be right in thinking that you are a daughter of Eve? My name's Lucy, said she, not quite understanding him. But you are, forgive me, you are what they call a girl, said the fawn. Of course I'm a girl, said Lucy. You are, in fact, human. Of course I'm a human, said Lucy, still a little puzzled. To be sure, said the fawn. How stupid of me. But I've never seen a son of Adam or daughter of Eve before. I am delighted. This is to say, then it stopped, as if he had been going to say something he had not intended, but had remembered in time. Delighted, it went on. Allow me to introduce myself. My name is Tumnus. I am very pleased to meet you, Mr. Tumnus, said Lucy. And may I ask, O Lucy, daughter of Eve, said Mr. Tumnus, how you have come into Narnia? Narnia? What is that? Said Lucy. This is the land of Narnia, said the fawn, where we are now, all that lies between the lamppost and the great castle of Cair Paravel on the eastern sea. And you have come from the wild woods of the west? I got in through the wardrobe in the spare room, said Lucy. Ah, said Mr. Tumnus in a rather melancholy voice, if only I had worked harder at geography when I was a little fawn, I should now no doubt know all about these strange countries, but it is too late now. But they aren't countries at all, said Lucy, almost laughing. It's only just back there. At least, I'm not sure. It is summer there. Meanwhile, said Mr. Tumnus, it is winter in Narnia, and has been for ever so long, and we shall both catch cold if we stand here talking in the snow. Daughter of Eve, from the far land of the spare where eternal summer reigns around the bright city of Wardrobe, how would you be if you came and had tea with me? Thank you very much, Mr. Tumnus, said Lucy, but I was wondering whether I ought to be getting back. It is only just round the corner, said the fawn, and there'll be a roaring fire, and toast, and sardines, and cake. Well, it's very kind of you, said Lucy, but I shan't be able to stay long. If you would take my arm, daughter of Eve, said Tumnus, I shall be able to hold the umbrella over both of us. That's the way. Now, off we go. And so Lucy found herself walking through the wood arm in arm with the strange creature, as if they had known each other all their lives. They had not gone far before they came to a place where the ground became rough, and there were rocks all about, and little hills up and little hills down. At the bottom of one small valley, Mr. Tumnus turned suddenly aside, as if he were going to walk straight into an unusually large rock. But at the last moment, Lucy found he was leading her into the entrance of a cave. As soon as they were inside, she found herself blinking in the light of a wood fire. Then Mr. Tumnus stooped and took a flaming piece of wood out of the fire with a neat little pair of tongs and lit a lamp. Now we shan't be long, he said, and immediately put a kettle on. Lucy thought she had never been in a nicer place. It was a little dry, clean cave of reddish stone, and a carpet on the floor with two little chairs, one for me and one for a friend. One for me and one for a friend, said Mr. Tumnus, and a table and a dresser and a mantelpiece over the fire, and above that a picture of an old fawn with a grey beard. In one corner there was a door which Lucy thought must lead to Mr. Tumnus's bedroom, and on one wall was a shelf full of books. Lucy looked at all these while he was setting out the tea things. They had titles like The Life and Letters of Silenus, or Nymphs and Their Ways, or Men, Monks, and Gamekeepers. A Study in Popular Legend, or Is Man a Myth? Now, daughter of Eve, said the fawn. And really it was a wonderful tea, where there was a nice brown egg lightly boiled for each of them, and then sardines on toast, and then buttered toast, and then toast with honey, and then sugar-topped cake. And when Lucy was tired of eating, the fawn began to talk. He had wonderful tales to tell of life in the forest. He told about the midnight dances, and how the nymphs who lived in the wells and the dryads who lived in the trees came out to dance with the fawns, about long hunting parties after the milk-white stag who could give you wishes if you caught him, about feasting and treasure-seeking with the wild red dwarves in deep mines and caverns far beneath the forest floor, and then about summer, when the woods were green, and old Silenus and his old fat donkey would come to visit them, and sometimes Bacchus himself, and then the streams would run with wine instead of water, and the whole forest would give itself up to jollification for weeks on end. Now that isn't always winter. Now, not that it isn't always winter now, he added gloomily. Then, to cheer himself up, he took out from its case on the dresser a strange little flute that looked as if it were made of straw, and began to play. And the tune he played made Lucy want to cry and laugh and dance and go to sleep all at the same time. It must have been hours later when she shook herself and said, "Oh, Mr. Tumnus, I'm so sorry to stop you, but I do love that little tune, but really, I must go home. I only meant to stay for a few minutes." "It's no good now, you know," said the fawn, laying down its flute and shaking his head very sorrowfully. "No good?" said Lucy, jumping up and feeling rather frightened. "What do you mean? I've got to go home at once. The others will be wondering what has happened to me." But a moment later she asked, "Mr. Tumnus, whatever is the matter?" For the fawn's brown eyes had filled with tears, and then the tears began trickling down its cheeks, and soon they were running off the end of its nose, and at last it covered its face with its hands and began to howl. Mr. Tumnus, said Lucy in great distress. Don't, what is the matter? Aren't you well, dear Mr. Tumnus? Do tell me what is wrong." But the fawn continued sobbing as if his heart would break. And even when Lucy went over and put her arms around him and lent him her handkerchief, he did not stop. He merely took the handkerchief and kept on using it, wringing it out with both hands whenever it got too wet to be any more use, so that presently Lucy was standing in a damp patch. "Mr. Tumnus," bawled Lucy in his ear, shaking him, "do stop. Stop it at once. You ought to be ashamed of yourself. A great big fawn like you. What on earth are you crying about?" Oh, sobbed Mr. Tumnus. "I'm crying because I am such a bad fawn." "I don't think you're a bad fawn at all," said Lucy. "I think you're a very good fawn. You're the nicest fawn I've ever met." Not that she isn't the only one. Sorry. Oh, you wouldn't say that if you knew," replied Mr. Tumnus between his sobs. "No, I'm a bad fawn. I don't suppose there ever was a worse fawn since the beginning of the world." "But what have you done?" asked Lucy. "My old father now," said Mr. Tumnus. "That's his picture over the mantelpiece. He would never have done such a thing like this." "A thing like what?" said Lucy. "Like what I've done," said the fawn. "Taken service under the White Witch. That's what I am. I am in the pay of the White Witch." "The White Witch? Who is she?" "Why, it is she who has got all Narnia under her thumb. It is she who makes it always winter and never Christmas. Think of that." "How awful," said Lucy. "But what does she pay you for?" "That's the worst of it," said Mr. Thomas with a deep groan. "I'm a kidnapper for her. That's what I am. Look at me, daughter of Eve. Would you believe that I'm the sort of fawn to meet a poor innocent child in the wood, one that had never done me any harm, and pretended to be friendly with it, and invite it home to my cave, all for the sake of lulling it asleep and then handing it over to the White Witch?" "No," said Lucy, "I'm sure you wouldn't do anything of the sort." "But I have," said the fawn. "Well," said Lucy rather slowly, for she wanted to be truthful and yet not too hard on him. "Well, that was pretty bad, but you're so sorry for it that I'm sure you would never do it again." "Daughter of Eve, don't you understand?" said the fawn. "It isn't something I have done. I'm doing it now, this very moment." "What do you mean?" cried Lucy, turning very white. "You are the child," said Tumnus. "I had orders from the White Witch that if I ever saw a son of Adam or daughter of Eve in the woods, I am to catch them and hand them over to her, and you are the first I have ever met, and I pretended to be your friend and asked you to tea, and all the time I've been meaning to wait till you were asleep and then go and tell her." "Oh, but you won't, Mr. Tumnus," said Lucy. "You won't, will you? Indeed, you really mustn't." "And if I don't," said he, beginning to cry again, "she's sure to find out, and she'll have my tail cut off, and my horns sawn off, and my beard plucked out, and she'll wave her wand over my beautiful cloven hoofs, and turn them into horrid solid hoofs, like wretched horses. And if she is extra and specially angry, she'll turn me into stone, and I shan't only be a statue of a fawn in her horrible house until the 4 thrones of Cair Paravel are filled. And goodness knows when that will happen, or whether it will ever happen at all." "I'm very sorry, Mr. Tumnus," said Lucy, "but please let me go home." "Of course I will," said the fawn. "Of course I've got to. I see that now. I hadn't known what humans were like before I met you. Of course I can't give you up to the witch, now that I know you. But we must be off at once. I'll see you back to the lamppost. I suppose you can find your own way from there to the spare room and wardrobe, eh? I'm sure I can, said Lucy. We must go as quickly as we can, said Mr. Tumnus. The whole wood is full of her spies. Even some of the trees are on our side. They both got up and left the tea things on the table, and Mr. Tumnus once more put up his umbrella and gave Lucy his arm, and they went out into the snow. The journey back was not at all like the journey to the Fawn's cave. They stole along as quickly as they could, without speaking a word, and Mr. Tumnus kept to the darkest places. Lucy was relieved when they reached the lamp-post again. Do you know your way from here, daughter of Eve? Said Mr. Tumnus. Lucy looked very hard between the trees, and could just see in the distance a patch of light that looked like daylight. Yes, she said, I can see the wardrobe door. Then be off home as quick as you can, said the Fawn, and can you ever forgive me for what I meant to do? Why, of course I can, said Lucy, shaking him heartily by the hand, and I do hope you won't get into any dreadful trouble on my account. Farewell, daughter of Eve, said he. Perhaps I may keep the handkerchief? Rather, said Lucy, and then ran towards the far-off patch of daylight, as quickly as her legs would carry her. And presently, instead of rough branches brushing past her, she felt coats, and instead of crunching snow under her feet, she felt wooden boards, and all at once she found herself jumping out of the wardrobe into the same empty room from which the whole adventure had started. She shut the wardrobe door tightly behind her, and looked around, panting for breath. It was still raining, and she could hear the voices of the others in the passage. I'm here, she shouted. I'm here. I've come back. I'm all right. Chapter 3. Edmund and the Wardrobe. Lucy ran out of the empty room into the passage and found the other three. It's all right, she repeated. I've come back. Why on earth are you talking about, Lucy? Asked Susan. Why, said Lucy in amazement, haven't you all been wondering where I was? So you've been hiding, have you? Said Peter. Poor old Lou, hiding and nobody noticed. You have to hide longer than that if you want people to start looking for you. But I've been away for hours and hours, said Lucy. The others all stared at one another. Batty, said Edmund, tapping his head. Quite batty. What do you mean, Lou? Asked Peter. What I said, answered Lucy. It was just after breakfast and I went into the wardrobe, and I've been away for hours and hours and had tea and all sorts of things had happened. Don't be silly, Lucy, said Susan. We've only just come out of that room a moment ago, and you were there then. She's not being silly at all, said Peter. She's just making up a story for fun, aren't you, Lou? And why shouldn't she? No, Peter, I'm not, she said. It's a magic wardrobe. There's a wood inside it, and it's snowing, and there's a fawn and a witch, and it's called Narnia. Come and see. The others did not know what to think, but Lucy was so excited that they all went back with her into the room. She rushed ahead of them, flung open the door of the wardrobe, and cried, Now, go in and see for yourselves. Why, you goose, said Lucy, putting her head inside and pulling the fur coats apart. It's just an ordinary wardrobe. Look, there's the back of it. Then everyone looked in and pulled the coats apart, and they all saw, Lucy herself saw, a perfectly ordinary wardrobe. Excuse me, sorry. There was no wood and no snow, only the back of the wardrobe with hooks on it. Peter went in and rapped his knuckles on it to make sure it was solid. All a jolly good hoax, Lou, he said, and came out again. You have really taken us in, I must admit. We half believed you. But it wasn't a hoax at all, said Lucy. Really and truly, it was all different a moment ago. Honestly, it was, I promise. Come, Lou, said Peter. That's going a bit far. You've had your joke. Haven't you better drop it now? Lucy grew very red in the face and tried to say something, though she hardly knew what she was trying to say, and burst into tears. For the next few days she was very miserable. She could have made it up with the others quite easily at any moment if she could have brought herself to say that the whole thing was only a story made up for fun. But Lucy was a very truthful girl, and she knew that she was really in the right, and she could not bring herself to say this. The others, who thought she was telling a lie, and a silly lie too, made her very unhappy. The two elder ones did this without meaning to do it, but Edmund could be spiteful, and on this occasion he was spiteful. He sneered and jeered at Lucy, and kept on asking her if she'd found any other new countries and any other new cupboards, all over the house. What made it worse was that these days ought to have been delightful. The weather was fine, and they were out of doors from morning to night, bathing, fishing, climbing trees, and lying in the heather, but Lucy could not properly enjoy any of it, and so things went on until the next wet day. The next day, when it came in the afternoon, and there was no sign of a break in the weather, they decided to play hide and seek. Susan was it, and as soon as all the others scattered to hide, Lucy went to the room where the wardrobe was. She did not mean to hide in the wardrobe, because she knew that would only set the others talking again about the whole wretched business. But she did want to have one more look inside it. For by this time she was beginning to wonder herself whether Narnia and the Fawn had not been a dream. The house was so large and complicated and full of hiding places that she thought she would have time to have one look into the wardrobe and then hide somewhere else. But as soon as she reached it, she heard steps in the passage outside, and then there was nothing for it but to jump into the wardrobe and hold the door closed. Hold the door closed behind her. She did not shut it properly because she knew that it was very silly to shut oneself into a wardrobe, even if it's not a magic one. Now, the steps she had heard were those of Edmund, and he came into the room just in time to see Lucy vanishing into the wardrobe. He at once decided to get into it himself, not because he thought it was a particularly good place to hide, but because he wanted to go on teasing her about her imaginary country. He opened the door. There were the coats hanging up as usual, and a smell of mothballs and darkness and silence, and no sign of Lucy. "She thinks I'm Susan come to catch her," said Edmund to himself, "and so she's keeping very quiet in the back." He jumped in and shut the door, forgetting what a very foolish thing it is to do. Then he began feeling about for Lucy in the dark. He had expected to find her in a few seconds, and was very surprised when he did not. He decided to open the door again and let in some light, but he could not find the door either. He didn't like this at all, and began groping wildly in every direction. He even shouted out, "Lucy, Lou, where are you? I know you're here." There was no answer, and Edmund noticed that his own voice had a curious sound, not the sound you expect in a cupboard, but a kind of open-air sound. He also noticed that he was unexpectedly cold, and then he saw a light. "Thank goodness," said Edmund. "The door must have swung open of its own accord." He forgot all about Lucy and went towards the light, which he thought was the open door of the wardrobe. But instead of finding himself stepping out into the spare room, he found himself stepping out from the shadows of some thick, dark fir trees into an open place in the middle of a wood. There was crisp, dry snow under his feet, and more snow lying onto the branches of the trees. Overhead there was pale blue sky, a sort of sky one sees on a fine winter day in the morning. Straight ahead of him, he saw between the tree trunks the sun, just rising, very red and clear. Everything was perfectly still, as if he were the only living creature in that country. There was not even a robin or a squirrel among the trees, and the woods stretched as far as he could see in every direction. He shivered. He now remembered that he had been looking for Lucy, and also how unpleasant he had been to her about her imaginary country, which now turned out to not have been imaginary at all. He thought that she must be somewhere quite close, and so he shouted, "Lucy, Lucy, I'm here too, Edmund." There was no answer. "She's angry about all the things I've been saying lately," thought Edmund. And though he did not like to admit it, that he had been wrong, he also did not much like being alone in this strange, cold, quiet place, so he shouted again, "I say, Lou, I'm sorry. I didn't believe you. Now you're right all along. Do come out. Make it Pax." Still, there was no answer. "Just like a girl," said Edmund to himself, "sulking somewhere and won't accept an apology." He looked around him again and decided he did not much like this place, and had almost made up his mind to go home when he heard, far off in the wood, a sound of bells. He listened, and the sound came nearer and nearer, and at last there swept into sight a sled drawn by 2 reindeer. The reindeer were about the size of Shetland ponies, and their hair was so white that even the snow hardly looked white compared with them. Their branching horns were gilded and shone like something on fire when the sunrise caught them. Their harness was of scarlet leather and covered with bells. On the sledge, driving the reindeer, sat a fat dwarf who would have been about 3 feet high if he had been standing. He was dressed in polar bear's fur, and on his head he wore a red hood with a long gold tassel hanging down from its point. His huge beard covered his knees and served him instead of a rug. But behind him, on a much higher seat in the middle of the sledge, sat a very different person. A great lady, taller than any woman that Edmund had ever seen. She also was covered in white fur up to her throat and held a long, straight golden wand in her hand and wore a gold crown on her head. Her face was white, not merely pale, but white like snow or paper or icing sugar, except for her very red mouth. It was a beautiful face in other respects, but proud and cold and stern. The sledge was a fine sight as it came sweeping towards Edmund with the bells jingling and the dwarf cracking his whip and the snow flying up at each side of it. "Stop," said the lady, and the dwarf pulled the reindeer up so sharply that they almost sat down. When they recovered themselves and stood clamping their bits and blowing in the frosty air, the breath coming out of their nostrils looked like smoke. "And what, pray, are you?" said the lady, looking hard at Edmund. My name's Edmund," said Edmund rather awkwardly. He did not like the way she looked at him. The lady frowned. "Is that how you address a queen?" she asked, looking sterner than ever. "I beg your pardon, your majesty, I didn't know," said Edmund. "Not know the Queen of Narnia?" cried she. "Ha! You shall know us better hereafter. But I repeat, what are you?" "Please, your majesty," said Edmund, "I don't know what you mean. I'm at school. At least I was. It's the holidays now." Chapter 4. Turkish Delight. "But what are you?" said the queen again. "Are you a great overgrown dwarf that has cut off his beard?" "No, your majesty," said Edmund. "I never had a beard. I'm a boy." "A boy," said she. "Do you mean you are a son of Adam?" Edmund stood still, saying nothing. He was too confused by this time to understand what the queen meant. "I see you are an idiot, whatever else you may be," said the queen. "Answer me once and for all, or I shall lose my patience. Are you a human?" "Yes, your majesty," said Edmund. "And how, pray, did you come to enter my dominions?" "Please, your majesty, I came through a wardrobe." "Wardrobe? What do you mean?" I opened a door and just found myself here, your majesty," said Edmund. "Huh!" said the queen, speaking more to herself than to him. "A door! A door from the world of men. I have heard of such things. This may wreck all, but he is only one, and he is easily dealt with." As she spoke these words, she rose from her seat and looked Edmund full in the face, her eyes flaming. At the same moment, she raised her wand. Edmund felt sure that she was going to do something dreadful, but he seemed unable to move. Then, just as he gave himself up for lost, she appeared to change her mind. "My poor child," said the queen in a different voice, "how cold you look. Come and sit with me here on the sledge, and I will put my mantle round you, and we will talk." Edmund did not like this arrangement at all, but he dared not disobey. He stepped onto the sledge and sat at her feet, and she put a fold of her fur mantle round him and tucked it in well. "Perhaps something hot to drink," said the queen. "Should you like that?" "Yes, please, your majesty," said Edmund, whose teeth were chattering. The queen took from somewhere amongst her wrappings a very small bottle, which looked as if it were made of copper. Then, holding out her arm, she let one drop fall from it into the snow beside the sledge. Edmund saw the drop for a second in midair, shining like a diamond. But the moment it touched the snow, there was a hissing sound, and there stood a jeweled cup full of something that steamed. The dwarf immediately took this and handed it to Edmund, with a bow and a smile, not a very nice smile. Edmund felt much better as he began to sip the hot drink. It was something he had never tasted before, very sweet and foamy and creamy, and it warmed him right down to his toes. "It is dull, son of Adam, to drink without eating," said the queen presently. "What would you like best to eat?" "Turkish Delight, please, your majesty," said Edmund. The queen let another drop fall from her bottle onto the snow, and instantly there appeared a round box tied with a green silk ribbon, which, when opened, turned out to contain several pounds of the best Turkish Delight. Each piece was sweet and light to the very center, and Edmund had never tasted anything more delicious. He was quite warm now and very comfortable. While he was eating, the queen kept asking him questions. At first, Edmund tried to remember that it was rude to speak with one's mouth full, but soon he forgot about this and thought only of trying to shovel down as much Turkish Delight as he could. And the more he ate, the more he wanted to eat, and he never asked himself why the queen should be so inquisitive. She got him to tell her that he had one brother and two sisters, and that one of his sisters had already been in Narnia and had met a faun there, and there was no one except himself and his brother and his sisters knew anything about Narnia. She seemed especially interested in the fact that there were 4 of them, and kept on coming back to it. "You are sure there's just 4 of you?" she asked. "2 sons of Adam and 2 daughters of Eve, neither more nor less." And Edmund, with his mouth full of Turkish delight, kept on saying, "Yes, I told you that before," and forgetting to call her Your Majesty, but she didn't seem to mind now. At last the Turkish delight was all finished, and Edmund was looking very hard at the empty box, and wishing that she would ask whether he would like some more. Probably the Queen knew quite well what he was thinking, for she knew, though Edmund did not, that this was enchanted Turkish delight, and that anyone who had once tasted it would want more and more of it, and would even, if they were allowed, go on eating until they killed themselves. But she did not offer him any more. Instead, she said to him, "Son of Adam, I should so much like to see your brother and your 2 sisters. Will you bring them to me?" "I'll try," said Edmund, still looking at the empty box. "Because if you did come again, bringing them with you, of course, I'd be able to give you some more Turkish delight. I can't do it now. The magic will only work once. In my own house, it would be another matter." Why can't we go to your house now?" said Edmund. When he had first got onto the sledge, he had been afraid that she might drive away with him to some unknown place from which he would not be able to get back, but he had forgotten about that fear now. "Sorry. It is a lovely place, my house," said the Queen. "I am sure you would like it. There are whole rooms full of Turkish delight, and what's more, I have no children of my own. I want a nice boy whom I can bring up as a prince, and who would be king of Narnia when I am gone. While he was prince, he would wear a gold crown and eat Turkish delight all day long. And you are much the cleverest and handsomest young man I have ever met. I think I would like to make you the prince someday when you bring the others and visit me." "Why not now?" said Edmund. His face had become very red, and his mouth and fingers were sticky. He did not look either clever or handsome, whatever the Queen might say. "Oh, but if I took you there now," said she, "I shouldn't see your brother and your sisters. I very much want to know your charming relations. You are to be the prince and, later on, the king. That is understood. But you must have courtiers and nobles. I will make your brother a duke and your sisters duchesses." "There's nothing special about them," said Edmund. "And anyway, I could always bring them some other time." "Ah, but once you were in my house," said the Queen, "you might forget all about them. You wouldn't enjoy yourself so much that they wouldn't want the brother of going... You would be enjoying yourself so much that you wouldn't want the bother of going to fetch them. No, you must go back to your own country now and come to me another day with them. You understand? It is not good coming without them." "But I don't even know the way back to my own country," pleaded Edmund. "That's easy," answered the Queen. "Do you see that lamp?" She pointed with her wand, and Edmund turned and saw the same lamppost under which Lucy had met the fawn. "Straight on beyond that is the way to the world of men. And now look the other way." Here she pointed in the opposite direction. "And tell me if you can see 2 little hills rising above the trees." "I think I can," said Edmund. "Well, my house is between those 2 hills. Next time you come, you only have to find the lamppost and look for those 2 hills and walk through the woods till you reach my house. But remember, you must bring the others with you. I might have to be very angry with you if you come alone." "I'll do my best," said Edmund. "And by the way," said the Queen, "you didn't tell them about me. It would be fun to keep it a secret between us 2, wouldn't it? Make it a surprise for them. Just bring them along to the 2 hills. A clever boy like you would easily think of some excuse for doing that. And when you come to my house, you could just say, 'Let's see who lives here,' or something like that. I'm sure that would be best. If your sister had met one of the fawns, she might have heard strange stories about me, nasty stories that might make her afraid to come see me. Fawns will say anything, you know. And now, please," said Edmund suddenly, "please, couldn't I just have 1 piece of Turkish delight to eat on my way home?" No, said the Queen with a laugh. "You must wait till next time." When she spoke, she signaled to the dwarf to drive on, but as the sledge swept away out of sight, the queen waved to Edmund, calling out, next time, don't forget, come soon." Edmund was still staring after the sledge when he heard someone calling his own name, and looking round he saw Lucy coming towards him from another part of the wood. "Oh, Edmund," she cried, "so you got in too, isn't it wonderful, and now—" "All right," said Edmund, "I see you were right, and it's a magic wardrobe after all. I'll say I'm sorry if you like, but where on earth have you been all this time? I've been looking for you everywhere." "If I'd known you'd gone in, I'd have waited for you," said Lucy, who was too happy and excited to notice how snappishly Edmund spoke, or how flushed and strange his face was. "I've been having lunch with dear Mr. Tumnus the Fawn, and he's very well, and the White Witch has done nothing to him for letting me go, so he thinks she can't have found out, and perhaps everything is going to be all right after all." "The White Witch?" said Edmund. "Who's she?" "She's a perfect, terrible person," said Lucy. "She calls herself the Queen of Narnia, though she has no right to be queen at all. And all the fauns and dryads and naiads and dwarves and animals, at least all the good ones, simply hate her. And said she can turn people into stone and do all kinds of horrible things. And she's made a magic so that it's always winter in Narnia. And she has made a magic so that it is always winter in Narnia. Always winter, but it never gets to be Christmas. And she drives about on a sledge drawn by reindeer, with her wand in her hand and crown on her head." Edmund was already feeling uncomfortable from having eaten too many sweets, and when he heard that the lady he had made friends with was a dangerous witch, he felt even more uncomfortable. But he still wanted to taste that Turkish delight again, more than he wanted anything else. "Who told you all that stuff about the White Witch?" he asked. "Mr. Tumnus the Fawn," said Lucy. "You can't always believe what fawns say," said Edmund, trying to sound as if he knew far more about them than Lucy. "Who said so?" said Lucy. "Everyone knows it," said Edmund. "Ask anybody you like, but it's pretty poor sport standing here in the snow. Let's go home." "Yes, let's," said Lucy. "Oh, Edmund, I'm glad you got in too. The others will have to believe in Narnia now that both of us have been there. What fun it will be!" But Edmund secretly thought that it would not be as good fun for him as for her. He would have to admit that Lucy had been right before all the others, and he felt that the others would all be on the side of the fawns and the animals, but he was already more than half on the side of the witch. He did not know what he would say or how he would keep his secret once they were all talking about Narnia. By this time they had walked a good way, then suddenly they felt coats around them, and instead of branches, and the next moment they were both standing outside the wardrobe in the empty room. "I say," said Lucy, "you do look awful. Edmund, don't you feel well?" "I'm all right," said Edmund, but this was not true. He was feeling very sick. "Come on, then," said Lucy. "Let's find the others. What a lot of adventure we shall have now that we're all in it together." "Can I have something to drink?" I'm going to pause for a second. That's better. Got something to drink. Thank you, Hero. Yes, I feel much better. I unmuted it. There we go. Chapter 5, Back on This Side of the Door. Because the game of hide and seek was still going on, it took Edmund and Lucy some time to find the others. But when at last they were all together, which happened in the long room where the suit of armor was, Lucy burst out. "Peter, Susan, it's all true. Edmund has seen it too. There is a country you can go see through the wardrobe. Edmund and I both got in. We met one another in there in the wood. Go on, Edmund. Tell them all about it. What's all this about, Ed? Said Peter. And now we come to one of the nastiest things in this story. Up to that moment, Edmund had been feeling sick and sulky and annoyed with Lucy for being right. But he hadn't made up his mind what to do. But when Peter suddenly asked him the question, he decided all at once to do the meanest and most spiteful thing he could think of. He decided to let Lucy down. Tell us, Ed, said Susan, and Edmund gave him a very superior look, as if he were far older than Lucy. That was really only a year's difference. And then a little sneaker and said, Oh yes, and I have been playing, pretending that all her story about a country in the wardrobe is true, just for fun, of course. There's nothing really there, really. Poor Lucy gave Edmund one look and rushed out of the room. Edmund, who was becoming a nastier person every minute, thought that he had scored a great success and went on at once to say, There she goes again. What's the matter with her? That's the worst of young kids. They always... Look here, said Peter, turning on him savagely. Shut up. You've been perfectly beastly to Lou ever since she started this nonsense about the wardrobe. And now you go playing games with her about it and setting her off again? I believe you did it simply out of spite. But that's all nonsense, said Edmund, very taken aback. Of course it's all nonsense, said Peter. That's just the point. Lou was perfectly all right when we left home, but since we've been down here, she seems to be either going queer in the head or else turning into a most frightful liar. Which, whatever it is, what good do you think you'll do by jeering and nagging at her one day and then encouraging her the next? I thought, said Edmund, but he couldn't think of anything to say. You didn't think anything at all, said Peter. It's just spite. You've always liked being beastly to anyone smaller than yourself. We've seen that at school before now. Do stop it, said Susan. It won't make things any better having a row between you two. Let's go find Lucy. It was not surprising that when they found Lucy a good deal later, everyone could see that she had been crying. Nothing they could say to her made any difference. She stuck to her story and said, I don't care what you think. I don't care what you say. You can tell the professor, or you can write it to Mother, or you can do anything you like. I know I've met a fawn in there, and I wish I'd stayed there, and you were all beasts. It was an unpleasant evening. Lucy was miserable, and Edmund was beginning to feel that his plan wasn't working as well as he'd expected. The two older ones were really beginning to think that Lucy was out of her mind. They stood in the passage talking about it in whispers long after she had gone to bed. The result was that the next morning they decided that they really would go and tell the whole thing to the professor. He'll write to Father if he thinks there is really something wrong with Lou, said Peter. It's getting beyond us. So they went and knocked on the study door, and the professor said, Come in, and got up and found chairs for them, and said he was quite at their disposal. Then he sat listening to them, with the tips of his fingers pressed together and never interrupting, till they had finished the whole story. After that, he said nothing for quite a long time. Then he cleared his throat and said the last thing either of them expected. How do you know, he asked, that your sister's story is not true? Oh, but, began Susan and then stopped. Anyone could see from the old man's face that he was perfectly serious. Then Susan pulled herself together and said, But Edmund said that they had only been pretending. That is a point, said the professor, which certainly deserves conversation. Very careful consideration. For instance, if you would excuse me for asking the question, does your experience lead you to regard your brother or your sister as the more reliable? I mean, which is the more truthful? That's just the funny thing about it, sir, said Peter. Up until now, I'd have said Lucy every time. And what do you think, my dear? Said the professor, turning to Susan. Well, said Susan, in general, I'd say the same as Peter, but this couldn't be true. All this about the wood and the fawn? That is more than I know, said the professor. And a charge of lying against someone whom you have always found truthful is a very serious thing. A very serious thing indeed. We were afraid it mightn't even be lying, said Susan. We thought there might be something wrong with Lucy. Madness, you mean? Said the professor quite coolly. Oh, you can make your minds easily about that. One has only to look at her and talk to her to see she is not mad. But then, said Susan, and stopped. I mean, that's not true. You can have, like, delusions, schizophrenia, and not be insane. You can be cognizantly, like, sane, but your your brain is playing mental tricks on you, so it's a lot harder to tell when somebody's actually having mental problems. But it's a sweet sentiment. Where was I? But then, said Susan and stopped. She had never dreamed that a grown-up would talk like the professor and didn't know what to think. Logic, said the professor, half to himself. Why don't they teach logic at these schools? There are only 3 possibilities. Either your sister is telling lies, or she is mad, or she's telling the truth. You know she doesn't tell lies, and it is obvious that she is not mad. For the moment then, and unless any further evidence turns up, we must assume that she is telling the truth. Susan looked at him very hard and was quite sure from his expression on his face that he was not making fun of them. But how could it be true, sir? said Peter. Why do you say that? Asked the professor. Well, for one thing, said Peter, if it was real, why doesn't everyone find this country every time they go into the wardrobe? I mean, there was nothing there when we looked. Even Lucy didn't pretend there was. What has that got to do with it? Said the professor. Well, sir, if things are real, they're there all the time. Are they? Said the professor. And Peter did not quite know what to say. But there was no time, said Lucy. Sorry, said Susan. Lucy had no time to have gone anywhere. Even if there was such a place, she came running after us the very moment we were out of the room. It was less than a minute, and she pretended to have been away for hours. That is the very thing that makes her story so likely to be true, said the professor. If there really is a door in this house that leads to some other world, and I should warn you that this is a very strange house, and even I know very little about it. If I say she has gone into another world, I should not be at all surprised to find that the other world had a separate time of its own, so that however long you stayed there, it would never take any of our time. On the other hand, I don't think many girls of her age would invent that idea for themselves. If she had been pretending, she would have hidden for a reasonable time before coming out and telling her story. But do you really mean it, sir, said Peter, that there could be other worlds all over the place just around the corner like that? Nothing is more probable, said the professor, taking off his spectacles and beginning to polish them while he muttered to himself, I wonder what they do teach them at these schools. But what are we to do? Said Susan. She felt that the conversation was beginning to get off the point. My dear young ladies, said the professor, suddenly looking up with a very sharp expression at both of them. There is only one plan which no one has yet suggested, and which is well worth trying. What's that? Said Susan. We might all try minding our own business, said he, and that was the end of the conversation. I heard you all laugh at that. After this, things were a good deal better for Lucy. Peter saw to it that Edmund stopped jeering at her, and neither she nor anyone else felt inclined to talk about the wardrobe at all. It had become a rather alarming subject, and so for a time it looked as if the adventures were coming to an end. But that was not to be. Oh, wow. I'm blind. I can't press the loudest dingling noise for people. We need to move that away from the mic. I'm gonna put that over there. Sorry. We can get to the end of this, I think. This house of the professor's, which even he knew so little about, was so old and famous that people from all over England used to come and ask permission to see over it. It was the sort of house that is mentioned in guidebooks and even in histories, and well it might be, for all manner of stories were told about it, some of them even stranger than the one I am telling you now. And when parties of sightseers arrived and asked to see the house, the professor always gave them permission, and Mrs. Macready, the housekeeper, showed them round, telling them about the pictures and the armor and the rare books in the library. Mrs. Macready was not fond of children, and she did not like to be interrupted when she was telling visitors all the things she knew. She had said to Susan and Peter almost on the first morning, along with a good many other instructions, "And please remember you're to keep out of the way whenever I'm taking a party over the house." "Just as any of us would want to waste half the morning trailing around a crowd of strange grown-ups," said Edmund, and the other three thought the same. That was how the adventures began for the third time. A few mornings later, Peter and Edmund were looking at the suit of armor and wondering if they could take it to bits when the two girls rushed into the room and said, "Look out, here comes Macready and a whole gang with her." "Sharp's the word," said Peter, and all four made through the door at the far end of the room. But when they got into the green room and beyond it, into the library, they suddenly heard voices ahead of them and realized Miss Macready must be bringing her party of sightseers up the back stairs instead of up the front stairs as they had expected. And after that, whether it was that they lost their heads, or that Miss Macready was trying to really catch them, or that some magic in the house had come to life and was chasing them into Narnia, they seemed to find themselves being followed everywhere until at last Susan said, "Oh, bother those trippers. Here, let's get into the wardrobe room till they've passed. No one will follow us in there." But the moment they went inside, they heard the voices in the passage, and then someone fumbling at the door, and then they saw the handle turning. "Quick," said Peter, "nowhere else," and flung open the wardrobe. All four of them bundled inside and sat there, panting in the dark. Peter held the door closed, but did not shut it, for, of course, he remembered, as every sensible person does, that you should never, never shut yourself in a wardrobe. And that's a good break for ants, even if we're a little early. And I'm going to pause this for a minute because I'm going to talk a little loud. So while the ads are going, we're going to read another little excerpt from that other book, My Book House Through Fairy Halls, which has got weird. What's wrong? Oh. Hero 5th can't keep up with me because I can't make up my mind. Yeah, this has got weird versions of fairy tales. This one's Sleeping Beauty. I highly doubt it's going to sound like the normal one, but... A long time ago, there lived a king and a queen who said every day, "Ah, if only I had a child." But for a long time, they had no child to gladden them. So, when a beautiful little daughter was born, the king could scarcely contain himself for joy. He ordered a splendid feast to celebrate the event, and he invited not only his friends, but also the fairies who gave gifts to newborn children. Like, there's specific fairies that do that. There were 13 such fairies in his kingdom, but the king was using gold plates to honor this special feast, and as he had only had 12 golden plates, he had asked only 12 of these fairies, leaving the 13th uninvited. Wow. Then the feast was held with all the splendor, and when it came to an end, the fairies bestowed their gifts on the baby. One gave her virtue, another good nature, a third wisdom, a fourth beauty, and so on, with everything that is good. But when the 11th had their say, and suddenly the 13th presented herself at the door. She was an ugly old woman whose gifts to children were always evil, so the father of little Briar Rose had done well to find no place for her at the feast. But now she forced her way into the hall, and in a fury to think she had not been invited, and went straight up to the baby's cradle. "This is my gift to the king's daughter," she cried. "In her 15th year she shall prick her finger with a spindle and die." With these spiteful words she stormed out of the hall. The king was left in terror, the queen was in a panic, and the guests were struck dumb and with fright. But just at that moment the 12th fairy stepped forward, for she had not yet made her promise for the child. "Nay," she said gently, "the princess shall not die. She shall fall into a deep sleep." Now the king was so anxious to guard his dear child from misfortune that he thought the best way would be to remove all spindles from his kingdom, and then she would never be able to prick her finger. So he gave orders the very next day that every spindle should be burned to ashes, and never another one made. Meanwhile, the gifts of the fairies were plenteous, filled in a little girl, for she was so beautiful, modest, and kind that all who saw her loved her. But it happened on the very day that she was 15 years old that the king and queen, being now quite at rest about their daughters, since they thought they had put all danger out of her reach, went away from home, leaving Briar Rose all alone. No sooner were they gone than the princess began to feel a great desire to go poking about the palace into all the strange places she had never visited before. So she went into all sorts of great echoing halls and queer little chambers, and at last she came to an old stone tower with a narrow stair that went winding upward. Up the rickety steps she started. She climbed, and at last she came to a door with a queer old rusty key in the lock. When she turned the key, the door sprang open. There, in a dusty little room, sat a little old woman in gray, and where's my glass? Little woman in gray, and she was working busily. "Good dame, my good dame," said Briar Rose. "What are you doing?" "I am spinning," said the old woman, nodding her head. And she drew out a thread of flax, twisting it deftly between her fingers. "And what is that little thing you send twirling around there so very, very merrily?" "A spindle, a spindle." "Ah," cried little Briar Rose, "I have never seen anything merrier." And she crept up closer and closer. At last, as she watched the twisting and twirling, she grew so anxious to try it herself that she said, "Good dame, pray let me try to spin." And the old woman, smiling till the curves of her mouth went way up under her long hook nose, then she handed Briar Rose the distaff and the spindle. The princess tucked the distaff under her left arm as she seen the old woman do, and started to pull out a thread. But alas, she knew nothing of spindles, nor had she ever been taught how to handle one properly. So at the very first turn, she clumsily thrust the point into her hand and pricked her finger. In an instant, spindle and distaff dropped to the floor. Little Briar Rose sank upon a bed and lay there in a deep sleep which spread out over the castle. Then the little old woman in gray disappeared, and the room in the tower was quiet and still. Down below, the king and queen, who had just returned to the great hall of the castle, went to sleep on their thrones, and all their courtiers with them. The horses went to sleep in their stables, the dogs went to sleep in the yard, the pigeons went to sleep on the roof, and the flies went to sleep on the wall. Even the fire on the kitchen hearth stopped flaming and slept in its embers. The great iron kettle above left off boiling, and the cook, who was just going to pull the hair of a careless scullery boy, let him go and sank down fast asleep. The wind fell, the flowers and grasses sank down on the earth, and on the trees before the castle not a single leaf stirred again. Round about the palace there began to grow a hedge of thorns. Snow fell with ice and sleet. So many years passed by, and every year the hedge grew denser and higher, till it hid every tower from sight. At last nothing at all could be seen of the castle, not even the flags on its roof. And over the spot, year in, year out, it was always frozen winter. But the story of the beautiful princess, asleep bound in her castle, still went abroad through the land. From time to time, the king's sons came determined to wake her, but they were so frightened at the sight of that thorny head that they turned and fled. And the faster they ran, the longer... Hello. Thank you. Do you mind shutting the door? And I don't think they would even like it because it's super spicy. Yeah, you feel there's jars of pasta sauce behind the air fryer on that counter. You can just open one of them and just use it, and just boil noodles. Is it? Are we already past the ads?
Yeah, it's only 3
Oh.
minutes.
Okay. I don't know. Maybe you need to take the phone with you, because I'm gonna misjudge. You said it's 3 minutes fast?
No, the ads are just 3 minutes.
No, but you set the timer 3 minutes early, right? 1 minute. Okay, so I just need to remember 1 minute. Okay. Book. Book. Thank you. Okay, back to Narnia. Chapter 6, Into the Forest. I wish the McCready would hurry up and take all these people away, said Susan presently. I'm getting horribly cramped. What a filthy smell of camphor, said Edmund. I expect the pockets of these coats are full of it, said Susan, to keep away the moths. There's something sticking into my back, said Peter. And isn't it cold? Said Susan. Now that you mention it, it is cold, said Peter. And hang it all, it's wet too. What's the matter with this place? I'm sitting on something wet. It's getting wetter every minute. He struggled to his feet. Let's get out, said Edmund. They've gone. Oh, said Susan suddenly, and everyone asked her what was the matter. I'm sitting against a tree, said Susan, and look, it's getting light over there. By Jove, you're right, said Peter, and look there, and there. It's trees all around. And this wet stuff, it's snow. Why, I do believe we've gone into Lucy's wood after all. And now there was no mistaking it, and all 4 children stood blinking in the daylight of a winter day. Behind them were coats hanging on pegs, and in front of them were snow-covered trees. Peter turned at once to Lucy. I apologize for not believing you, he said. I am sorry. Will you shake hands? Of course, said Lucy, and did. And now, said Susan, what do we do next? Do, said Peter. Why, go and explore the wood, of course. Ah, said Susan, stamping her feet. It's pretty cold. What about putting on some of these coats? They're not ours, said Peter doubtfully. I'm sure nobody would mind, said Susan. It isn't as if we wanted to take them out of the house. We shan't take them even out of the wardrobe. I never thought of that, Sue, said Peter. Of course, now you've put it in that way, I see. No one could say you've bagged a coat as long as you leave it in the wardrobe, where you found it. And I suppose this whole country is the wardrobe. They immediately carried out Susan's very sensible plan. The coats were rather too big for them, so they came down to their heels and looked more like royal robes than coats when they had put them on. But they all felt a good deal warmer, and each thought the other looked better in their new getup and more suitable for the landscape. We can pretend we are Arctic explorers, said Lucy. Sorry, that was Lucy's voice, not Susan's. We can pretend we're Arctic explorers, said Lucy. This is going to be exciting enough without pretending, said Peter, as he began leading the way forward into the forest. There were heavy, darkish clouds overhead, and it looked as if there might be more snow before night. I say, began Edmund presently, oughtn't we be bearing a bit more to the left? That is, if we're aiming for the lamp post. He had forgotten for the moment that he must pretend never to have been in the wood before. The moment the words were out of his mouth, he realized he had given himself away. Everyone stopped. Everyone stared at him. Peter whistled. So you really were here, he said. That time Lou said she met you in here, and you made out she was telling lies? There was a dead silence. Well, of all the poisonous little beasts, said Peter, and shrugged his shoulders and said no more. There seemed, indeed, no more to say. And presently the 4 resumed their journey, but Edmund was saying to himself, I'll pay you all for this, you pack of stuck-up, self-satisfied prigs. Where are we going anyway, said Susan, chiefly for the sake of changing the subject. I think Lou ought to be the leader, said Peter. Goodness knows she deserves it. Where will you take us, Lou? What about going to see Mr. Tumnus, said Lucy. He's the nice fawn I told you about. Everyone agreed to this, and off they went, walking briskly and stamping their feet. Lucy proved a good leader. At first she wondered whether she would be able to find the way, but she recognized an odd-looking tree in one place and a stump in another, and brought them on to where the ground became uneven, and into the little valley, and at last to the very door of Mr. Tumnus's cave. But there was a terrible surprise awaiting them. The door had been wrenched off its hinges and broken to bits. Inside the cave was dark and cold, and had the damp feel and smell of a place that had not been lived in for several days. Snow had drifted in from the doorway, and they were heaped on the floor mixed with something black, which turned out to be the charred sticks and ashes from the fire. Someone had apparently flung it about the room and then stamped it out. The crockery lay smashed on the floor, and the picture of the fawn's father had been slashed into shreds with a knife. "This is a pretty good washout," said Edmund. "Not much good coming here." "What is this?" said Peter, stooping down. He had just noticed a piece of paper which had been nailed through the carpet of the floor. "Is there anything written on it?" asked Susan. "Yes, I think there is," said Peter, "but I can't read it in this light. Let's get out into the open air." They all went out into the daylight and crowded round Peter as he read out the following words. "The former occupant of these premises, the Fawn Tumnus, is under arrest and awaiting the trial on a charge of high treason against Her Imperial Majesty Jadis, Queen of Narnia, Chatelaine of Cair Pavel, Empress of the Lone Islands, etc. Also of comforting her said Majesty's enemies, harboring spies, and fraternizing with humans. Signed, Malgrim, Captain of the Secret Police. Long live the Queen." The children stared at each other. "I don't know that I'm going to like this place after all," said Susan. Who is the Queen? Who is this Queen Lou? Who is this Queen Lou? Said Peter. "Do you know anything about her?" "She isn't a real queen at all," answered Lucy. "She's a horrible witch, the White Witch. Everyone, all the wood people hate her. She made an enchantment over this whole country so that it's always winter here and never Christmas." I wonder if there's any point in going on," said Susan. "I mean, it doesn't seem particularly safe here, and it looks as if it won't be much fun either. And it's getting colder every minute, and we've brought nothing to eat. What about just going home?" "Oh, but we can't, said Lucy suddenly. "Don't you see? We can't just go home, not after this. It's all on my account that the poor fawn got into this trouble. He hid me from the witch and showed me the way back. That's what it means by comforting the queen's enemies and fraternizing with humans. We simply must try to rescue him." "A lot we could do," said Edmund, "when we haven't even got anything to eat." "Shut up, you," said Peter, who was still very angry with Edmund. "What do you think, Susan?" "I have a horrid feeling that Lou is right," said Susan. "I don't want to go a step further, and I wish we'd never come. But I think we must try to do something for Mr. whatever his name is. I mean, the fawn." "That's what I feel too," said Peter. "I'm worried about having no food with us. I'd vote for going back and getting something from the larder, only there doesn't seem to be any certainty of getting into this country again when once you've gotten out of it. I think we'd have to go on." "So do I," said the both girls. "If only we knew where the poor chap was imprisoned," said Peter. They were all still wondering what to do next when Lucy said, "Look, there's a robin with such a red breast. It's the first bird I've seen here. I say, I wonder, can birds talk in Narnia? It almost looks as if it wanted to say something to us." Then she turned to the robin and said, "Please, can you tell us where Tumnus the fawn has been taken to?" And as she said this, she took a step towards the bird. It at once flew away, but only as far as to the next tree. There it perched and looked at them with very hard, as if it understood all that they had been saying. Almost without noticing that they had done so, the four children went a step or two nearer to it. At this, the robin flew away again to the next tree, and once more looked at them very hard. You couldn't have found a robin with a redder chest or a brighter eye. "Do you know," said Lucy, "I really believe he means us to follow him." "I have an idea he does," said Lucy. "What do you think, Peter?" "Well, we might as well try it," answered Peter. The robin appeared to understand the matter thoroughly. It kept going from tree to tree every few yards ahead of them, but always so near that they could easily follow it. In this way it led them on, slightly downhill. Whenever the robin alighted, a little shower of snow would fall off the branch. Presently the clouds parted overhead, and the winter sun came out, and the snow all around them grew dazzlingly bright. They had been traveling in this way for about half an hour when the two girls in front, when Edmund said to Peter, if you're not still too high and mighty to talk to me, I've something to say which you better listen to." What is it? Said Peter. Hush, not so loud, said Edmund. There's a good frightening the girls. But have you realized what we're doing? What? Said Peter, lowering his voice to a whisper. We're following a guide we know nothing about. How do we know which side the bird's on? Why shouldn't it be leading us into a trap? That's a nasty idea. Still, a robin, you know? There are good birds in all the stories I've heard. I'm sure a robin wouldn't be on the wrong side. Gosh, if it comes to that, which is the right side? How do we know that the fawns are in the right and the queen, yes, I know we've been told she's a witch, is in the wrong? We don't really know anything about either. The fawn saved Lucy. He said he did, but how do we know? And there's another thing too. Has anyone the least idea of the way home from here? Great Scott, said Peter. Hadn't thought of that. And no chance of dinner either, said Edmund. Chapter 7. A Day with the Beavers. While the two boys were whispering behind, both the girls suddenly cried out, "Oh!" and stopped. "The robin!" cried Lucy. "The robin! It flown away!" And so it had, right out of sight. "And now what do we do?" said Edmund, giving Peter a look which as much said, "What did I tell you?" "Shh, look," said Susan. "What?" said Peter. "There's something moving among the trees over there to the left." They all stared as hard as they could, and no one felt very comfortable. "There it goes again," said Susan presently. "I saw it that time too," said Peter. "It's still there. It's just gone behind that big tree." "What is it?" asked Lucy, trying very hard not to sound nervous. "Whatever it is," said Peter, "it's dodging us. It's something that doesn't want to be seen." "Let's go home," said Susan, and then, though nobody said it out loud, everyone suddenly realized the same fact that Edmund had whispered to Peter at the end of the last chapter. They were lost. "What's it like?" said Lucy. It's a kind of animal," said Susan, and then, look, quick, there it is." They all saw it this time, a whiskered, furry face which had looked out at them from behind a tree, but this time it didn't immediately draw back. Instead, the animal put its paws against its mouth, just as humans put their fingers on their lips when they are signaling you to be quiet. Then it disappeared again. The children all stood holding their breaths. A moment later, the stranger came out from behind the tree, glanced round as if it were afraid of something watching, and said, "Hush," and made signs for them to join it in the thicker bit of woods where it was standing, and then once more disappeared. "I know what it is," said Peter. "It's a beaver. I saw the tail." It wants us to go to it," said Susan. And it is warning us not to make a noise." "I know," said Peter. "The question is, are we going to it or not? What do you think, Lou?" "I think it's a nice beaver," said Lucy. "Yes, but how do we know?" said Edmund. "Shan't we have to risk it?" said Susan. "I mean, it's no good just standing here, and I feel I want some dinner." At this moment, the beaver again popped its head out from behind the tree and beckoned earnestly to them. "Come on," said Peter. "Let's give it a try. All keep close together. We ought to be a match for one beaver if it turns out to be an enemy." So the children all got close together and walked up to the tree and in behind it. And there, sure enough, they found the beaver. But it still drew back, saying to them in a hoarse, throaty whisper, "Further in, come further in, right in here. We're not safe in the open." Only when it had led them into a dark spot where 4 trees grew so close together that their brows met and the brown earth and pine needles could be seen underfoot because no snow had been able to fall there, did it begin to talk to them. "Are you the sons of Adam and the daughters of Eve?" it said. We are some of them," said Peter. "Shh," said the beaver. "Not so loud, please. We're not safe even here." "Why, who are you afraid of?" said Peter. "There's no one here but ourselves." "There are the trees," said the beaver. "They're always listening. Most of them are on our side, but there are trees that would betray us to her. You know who I mean." And it nodded its head several times. "Hello." Take a break. What's going on? Do you want me to find the spaghetti?
There is no spaghetti. Spaghetti's gone. There is no spaghetti in the set.
that's what I said. Yeah, we can. Oh, I'm sorry. Can you shut the door so I can keep going? Love you, bye. Sorry about that. You know who I am? Nodded its head several times. If it comes to talking about sides, said Edmund, how do we know your friend? Not meaning to be rude, Mr. Beaver, said Peter, but you see, we're strangers. Quite right, said the beaver. Here is my token. With these words, it held up to them a little white object. They all looked at it in surprise, till suddenly Lucy said, Oh, of course, my handkerchief. The one I gave to poor Mr. Tumnus. That's right, said the beaver. Poor fellow. He got wind of the arrest before it actually happened, and handed this over to me. He said that if anything happened to him, I must meet you here and take you on too. Here the beaver's voice sank into silence, and it gave one or two very mysterious nods. Then, signaling to the children to stand as close around as they possibly could, so that their faces were actually tickled by its whiskers, it added in a low whisper, They say Aslan is on the move. Perhaps has already landed. And now a very curious thing happened. None of the children knew who Aslan was, as more than you do. But the moment the beaver had spoken these words, everyone felt quite different. Perhaps it had sometimes happened to you in a dream that someone says something which you don't understand, but in the dream it feels as if some enormous meaning, either a terrifying one, which turns the whole dream into a nightmare, or else a lovely meaning, too lovely to put into words, which makes the dream so beautiful that you remember it all your life and are always wishing you could get into that dream again. It was like that now. At the name of Aslan, each one of the children felt something jump inside. Edmund felt a sensation of mysterious horror. Peter felt suddenly brave and adventurous. Susan felt as if some delicious smell or some delightful strain of music had just floated by her. And Lucy got the feeling you have when you wake up in the morning and realize that it is the beginning of the holidays or the beginning of summer. And what about Mr. Tumnus, said Lucy. Where is he? Shh, said the beaver. Not here. I must bring you where we can have a real talk and also dinner. No one except Edmund felt any felt any difficulty about trusting the beaver, and everyone, including Edmund, was very glad to hear the word dinner. They therefore all hurried along behind their new friend, who led them at a surprisingly quick pace, and always in the thickest part of the forest. For over an hour, everyone was feeling very tired and very hungry, when suddenly the trees began to get thinner in front of them, and the ground to fall steeply downwards. A minute later, they came out under the open sky. The sun was still shining, and found themselves looking down on a fine sight. They were standing on the edge of a steep, narrow valley, at the bottom of which ran, at least it would have been running if it had been frozen, a fairly large river. Just below them, a dam had been built across the river, and when they saw it, everyone suddenly remembered that, of course, beavers are always making dams, and felt quite sure that Mr. Beaver had made this one. They also noticed that he now had a sort of modest expression on his face, the sort of look people have when you're visiting a garden they've made or reading a story they've written. So it was only common politeness when Susie said, What a lovely dam, and Mr. Beaver didn't say hush. Sorry. And Mr. Beaver didn't say hush this time, but merely a trifle, and it isn't really finished. Above the dam there was what ought to have been a deep pool, but now, of course, a level floor of dark green ice, and below the dam, much lower down, was more ice. But instead of being smooth, this was all frozen into the foamy and wavy shapes in which the water had been rushing along at the very moment when the frost came. And where the water had been trickling over and spurting through the dam, there was now a glittering wall of icicles, as if the side of the dam had been covered all over with flowers and wreaths and festoons of the purest sugar. And out in the middle, and partly on top of the dam, was a funny little house, shaped rather like an enormous beehive, and from a hole in the roof, smoke was going up, so that when you saw it, especially if you were hungry, you once thought of cooking, and became hungrier than you were before. That was what the others chiefly noticed, but Edmund noticed something else. A little lower down, the river there was a smaller river which came down another small valley to join it. In looking up that valley, Edmund could see two small hills, and he was almost sure that they were the two hills which the White Witch had pointed out to him when he parted from her at the lamp post the other day. And then between them, he thought must be her palace, only a mile off or less, and he thought about Turkish delight and about being a king. And I wonder how Peter will like that, he asked himself, and horrible ideas came into his head. Here we are, said Mr. Beaver, and it looks as if Mrs. Beaver is expecting us. I'll lead the way, but be careful and don't slip. The top of the dam was wide enough to walk on, though not for humans, a very nice place to walk because it was covered with ice. And though the frozen pool was level with it on one side, there was a nasty drop to the lower river on the other. Along this route, Mr. Beaver led them in single file right out to the middle, where they could look a long way up the river and a long way down it. And when they had reached the middle, they were at the door of the house. Here we are, Mrs. Beaver, said Mr. Beaver. I've found them. Here are the sons and daughters of Adam and Eve. And they all went in. The first thing Lucy noticed as she went in was a burning sound. A burring sound. And the first thing she saw was a kind-looking old she-beaver sitting in the corner with a thread in her mouth working busily at her sewing machine. And it was from it that the sound came. They've got sewing machines? I guess pedals. Sorry. She stopped her work and got up as soon as the other children came in. So you've come at last, she said, holding out both her wrinkled old paws. At last, to think that I ever should live to see this day. The potatoes are boiling and the kettle's singing. I dare say, Mr. Beaver, you'll get us some fish. I will, said Mr. Beaver, and went out of the house. Peter went with him, and across the ice of the deep pool to where he had a little hole in the ice which he kept open every day with his hatchet. They took a pail with them. Mr. Beaver sat down quietly at the edge of the hole. He didn't seem to mind it being so chilly, looked hard into it, then suddenly shot in his paw, and before you could say Jack Robinson, had whisked out a beautiful trout. Then he did it all over again, until they had a fine catch of fish. Meanwhile, the girls were helping Mrs. Beaver to fill the kettle and lay the table and cut the bread and put the plates in the oven to heat and draw a huge jug of beer for Mr. Beaver from a barrel which stood in one corner of the house, and to put on the frying pan and to get the drippings hot. Lucy thought the Beavers had a very snug little home, though it was not all like Mr. Tumnus's cave. There were no books or pictures, and instead of beds there were bunks, like on board ship built into the wall. And there were hams and strings of onions hanging from the roof, and against the walls were gumboots and oilskins and hatchets and pairs of shears and spades and trowels and things for carrying mortar in, and fishing rods and fishing nets and sacks. And the cloth on the table, though very clean, was very rough. Just as the frying pan was nicely hissing, Peter and Mr. Beaver came in with the fish, which Mr. Beaver had already opened with his knife and cleaned out in the open air. You can think how good the new caught fish smelled while they were frying, and how the hungry children longed for them to be done, and how much hungrier they had become before Mr. Beaver said, "Now we're nearly ready." Susan drained the potatoes and then put them all back in the empty pot to dry to the side of the range, while Lucy was helping Mrs. Beaver to dish up the trout, so that in a very few minutes everyone was drawing up their stools. It was all three-legged stools in the Beaver's house, except for Mr. Beaver's own special rocking chair beside the fire, and preparing to enjoy themselves. There was a jug of creamy milk for the children, Mr. Beaver stuck to beer, and a great big lump of deep yellow butter in the middle of the table, from which everyone took as much as he wanted to go with his potatoes, and all the children thought, and I agree with them, that there is nothing to beat good freshwater fish if you eat it when it has been alive half an hour ago and has come out of the pan half a minute ago. And when they had finished the fish, Mrs. Beaver brought unexpectedly out of the oven a great and glorious sticky marmalade roll, steaming hot, and at the same time moved the kettle onto the fire, so that when they had finished the marmalade roll, the tea was made and ready to be poured out. And when each person had got his or her cup of tea, each person shoved back his or her stool so as to be able to lean against the wall and give a long sigh of contentment. "And now," said Mr. Beaver, pushing away his empty beer mug and pulling his cup of tea towards him, "if you'll just wait till I've got my pipe lit up and going nicely, why, now we can get to business. It's snowing again," he added, cocking his head cocking his eye at the window. "That's all the better, because it means we shan't have any visitors, and if anyone should have been trying to follow you, why, he won't find any tracks." Chapter 8. What happened after dinner. "And now," said Lucy, "do please tell us what happened to Mr. Tumnus." "Ah, that's bad," said Mr. Beaver, shaking his head. "That's a very, very bad business. There's no doubt he was taken off by the police. I've got that from a bird who saw it done." "But where's he been taken to?" asked Lucy. "Well, they were heading northwards when they were last seen, and we all know what that means." "No, we don't." "Sorry, Susan." "No, we don't," said Susan. Mr. Beaver shook his head in a very gloomy fashion. "I'm afraid it means that they were taking him to her house," he said. "But what'll they do to him, Mr. Beaver?" gasped Lucy. "Well," said Mr. Beaver, "you can't exactly say for sure, but there's not many taken in there that ever comes out again. Statues. All full of statues, they say it is. In the courtyard and up the stairs and up in the hall, people she's turned," he paused and shuddered, "turned into stone." "But Mr. Beaver," said Lucy, "can't we, we must do something to save him. It's too dreadful. It's all my count." "I don't doubt you'd save him if you could, dearie," said Mr. Beaver, "but you've no chance of getting into that house again, against her will, and ever coming out alive." "Couldn't we have some stratagem?" asked Peter. Couldn't we dress up as something, or pretend to be, peddlers or anything? Or watch till she was gone out, and or hang it all, there must be some way. This fawn saved my sister at his own risk, Mr. Beaver. We can't just leave him to have that done to him." "It's no good, son of Adam," said Mr. Beaver. "No good you're trying, of all people. But now that Aslan is on the move..." Itchy. Sorry, itchy. "Oh yes, tell us about Aslan," said several voices at once, for once again that strange feeling, like the first signs of spring, like good news, had come over them. "Who is Aslan?" asked Susan. "Aslan," said Mr. Beaver, "why, don't you know? He's the king. He's the lord of this whole wood. But not often here, you understand. Never in my time, or my father's time. But the word has reached us that he has come back. He is in Narnia at this moment. He'll settle the White Queen all right. It is he, not you, who will save Mr. Tumnus." "She won't turn him into stone too," said Edmund. "Lord love you, son of Adam, what a simple thing to say," answered Mr. Beaver with a great laugh. "Turn him into stone? If she can stand on her own 2 feet and look him in the face, it'll be most she can do, and more than I expect her. No, he'll put her all to rights, and say it an old rhyme in these parts, as it says in an old rhyme in these parts. Wrong will be right when Adam comes in sight. Aslan, goddamn. Wrong will be right when Aslan comes in sight. At the sound of his roar, sorrows will be no more. When he bares his teeth, winter meets its death, and when he shakes his mane, we shall have spring again. You'll understand when you see him." "But shall we see him?" asked Susan. "My daughter of Eve, that's what I brought you here for. I'm to lead you where you shall meet him," said Mr. Beaver. Is he a man?" asked Lucy. "Aslan a man?" said the Beaver sternly. "Certainly not. I tell you he is the king of the woods, and the son of the great emperor beyond the sea. Don't you know who is the king of beasts? Aslan is a lion, the great lion." "Oh," said Susan. "I thought he was a man. Is he quite safe? I shall feel rather nervous about meeting a lion." "That you will, dearie, but no mistake," said Mrs. Beaver. "If there's anyone who can appear before Aslan without their knees knocking, they're either braver than most, or else just silly." "Then he isn't safe," said Lucy. "Safe?" said Mr. Beaver. "Don't you hear what Mrs. Beaver tells you? Who said anything about safe? Of course he isn't safe, but he's good. He's the king, I tell you." "I'm longing to see him," said Peter, "even if I do feel frightened when it comes to the point." "That's right, son of Adam," said Mr. Beaver. bringing his paw down on the table with a crash that made all the cups and saucers rattle. "And so you shall. Word has been sent that you are to meet him tomorrow, if you can, at the stone table." "Where's that?" said Lucy. "I'll show you," said Mr. Beaver. "It's down the river, a good step from here. I'll take you to it." "But meanwhile, what about Mr. Tumnus?" said Lucy. "The quickest way you can help him is by going to meet Aslan," said Mr. Beaver. "Once he's with us, then we can begin doing things. Not that we don't need you to, for there's another of the old rhymes. When Aslan's flesh and Adam's have... When Adam's flesh and Adam's bone sits at Cair Paravel enthroned, the evil time will be over and done. So things must be drawing near to an end, now he's come and you've come. We've heard of Aslan coming into these parts before, long ago. Nobody can say when, but there's never been any of your race here before." "That's what I don't understand, Mr. Beaver," said Peter. "I mean, isn't the witch herself human?" "She'd like us to believe it," said Mr. Beaver. "And it's on that she bases her claim to be queen. But she is no daughter of Eve. She comes from your father Adam's," here Mr. Beaver bowed, "your father Adam's first wife. Here they call her Lilith. Your father Adam's first wife, her they called Lilith. And she was the one of the jinn. That's what she comes from on one side. And on the other side she comes of giants. No, there isn't a drop of real human blood in the witch." "That's why she's bad, as though she's bad all through, Mr. Beaver," said Mrs. Beaver. "True enough, Mrs. Beaver," replied he. "There may be two views about humans, meaning no offense to the present company, but there's no two views about things that look like humans and aren't." "I've known good dwarves," said Mrs. Beaver. "So have I, now you've come to speak of it," said her husband, "but precious few, and they were the ones least like men. But in general, take my advice. When you meet anything that's going to be human and isn't yet, or used to be human once and isn't now, or ought to be human and isn't, you keep your eyes on it and feel for your hatchet. And that's why the witch is always on the lookout for any human in Narnia. She's been watching for you this many a year, and if she knew there were 4 of you, she'd be more dangerous still." "What's that to do with it?" said Peter. "Because of another prophecy," said Mr. Beaver. "Down at Cair Paravel, that's the castle on the sea coast, down at the mouth of this river, where ought to be the capital of the whole country if all of it was as it should be. Down at Cair Paravel, there are 4 thrones, and it's a saying in Narnia's time, out of mind, that when 2 sons of Adam and 2 daughters of Eve sit on those 4 thrones, that it will be the end of not only of the White Witch's reign, but of her life. And that is why we have to be so cautious as we came along. For if she knew about you 4, your lives wouldn't be worth a shake of my whiskers." All the children had been attending so hard to what Mr. Beaver was telling them that they had noticed nothing else for a long time. Then, during the moment of silence that followed his last remark, Lucy suddenly said, "Say, where's Edmund?" There was a dreadful pause, and then everyone began asking, "Who saw him last? How long has he been missing? Is he outside?" And then they all rushed to the door and looked out. The snow was falling thickly and steadily. The green ice of the pool had vanished under a thick white blanket, and from where the little house stood in the center of the dam, they could hardly see either bank. Out they went, plunging well over their ankles into the soft new snow, and went round the house in every direction. "Edmund! Edmund!" they called till they were hoarse. But the silent falling snow seemed to muffle their voices, and there was not even an echo in answer. "How perfectly dreadful," said Susan, as they last came back into despair. "Oh, how I wish we'd never come." "What on earth are we to do, Mr. Beaver?" said Peter. "Do?" said Mr. Beaver, who was already putting on his snow boots. "Do? We must be off at once. We haven't a moment to spare." "We'd best divide into 4 search parties," said Peter, "and all go in different directions. Whoever finds him must come back at once and—" "Search parties, son of Adam," said Mr. Beaver. "What for?" Why, to look for Edmund, of course. There's no point looking for him, said Mr. Beaver. What do you mean, said Susan. He can't be far away yet, and we've got to find him. What do you mean when there's no use looking for him? The reason there's no use looking, said Mr. Beaver, is that we know already where he's gone. Everyone stared in amazement. Don't you understand, said Mr. Beaver. He's gone to her, to the White Witch. He has betrayed us all. Oh, surely, oh, really, said Susan. He can't have done that. Can't he? Said Mr. Beaver, looking very hard at the three children, and everything they wanted to say died on their lips, for each felt suddenly quite certain inside that this was exactly what Edmund had done. But will he know the way? Has he been in this country before? Said Mr. Beaver. Has he ever been here alone? Yes, said Lucy almost in a whisper. I'm afraid he has. And did he tell you what he'd done or who he'd met? Well, no, he didn't, said Lucy. Then mark my words, said Mr. Beaver. He has already met the White Witch and joined her side in being told where she lives. I didn't like to mention it before, he being your brother and all, but the moment I set eyes on that brother of yours, I said to myself, treacherous. He had the look of one who had been with the witch and eaten her food. You can always tell them if you've lived long in Narnia. Something about their eyes. All the same, said Peter in a rather choking sort of voice, we'll still have to go and look for him. He's our brother after all, even if he is a rather little beast, and he's only a kid. Go to the witch's house, said Mrs. Beaver. Don't you see that the only chance of saving either him or yourself is to keep away from her? How do you mean? Said Lucy. Why, all she wants is to get all four of you. She's thinking all the time of those 4 thrones at Cair Paravel. Once you were all 4 inside her house, her job would be done, and there'd be 4 new statues in her collection before you'd have time to speak. But she'll keep him alive as long as he's the only one she's got, because she'll want to use him as a decoy, as bait to catch the rest of you. Oh, can no one help us? Wailed Lucy. Only Aslan, said Mr. Beaver. We must go on and meet him. That's our only chance now. It seems to me, dearies, said Mrs. Beaver, that it is very important to know just when he slipped away. How much he can tell her depends on how much he heard. For instance, had we started talking of Aslan before he left? If not, then we may do very well, for he won't know that Aslan has come to Narnia, or that we are meeting him, and will be quite off her guard as far as that is concerned. I don't remember his being here when we were talking about Aslan, began Peter, but Lucy interrupted him. Oh, yes, he was, she said miserably. Don't you remember? It was he who asked whether the witch couldn't turn Aslan into stone, too. So he did, by Jove, said Peter. Just the sort of thing he would say, too. Worse and worse, said Mr. Beaver. And the next thing is this. Was he still here when I told you that the place for meeting Aslan was the stone table? And of course, no one knew the answer to this question. Because if he was, continued Mr. Beaver, then she'll simply sledge down in front in that direction and get between us and the stone table and cut us on our way down. In fact, we shall be cut off from Aslan. But that isn't what she'll do first, said Mrs. Beaver. Not if I know her. The moment that Edmund tells her we're all here, she'll set out to catch us on this very night. And if he's been gone about half an hour, she'll be here in about another 20 minutes. You're right, Mrs. Beaver, said her husband. We must all get away from here. There's not a moment to lose. Chapter 9. In the Witch's House. And now, of course, you want to know what happened to Edmund. He had eaten his share of the dinner, but he hadn't really enjoyed it, because he was thinking all the time about Turkish delight. And there's nothing that spoils the taste of good ordinary food half so much as the memory of bad magic food. And he had heard this conversation, and hadn't enjoyed it much either, because he kept on thinking that the others were taking no notice of him, and trying to give him the cold shoulder. They weren't, but he imagined it. And then he had listened until Mr. Beaver told them about Aslan, until he had heard the whole arrangement for meeting Aslan at the stone table. It was then that he began very quietly to edge himself under the curtain which hung over the door, for the mention of Aslan gave him a mysterious and horrible feeling, just as it gave the others a mysterious and lovely feeling. Just as Mr. Beaver had repeated the rhyme about Adam's flesh and Adam's bone, Edmund had been very quietly turning the door handle, and just before Mr. Beaver had begun telling them that the White Witch wasn't human at all, but half djinn and half giantess, Edmund had gone outside into the snow and cautiously closed the door behind him. You mustn't think that even now Edmonton was quite so bad that he actually wanted his brothers and sisters to be turned into stone. He did want Turkish delight and to be a prince, and later a king, and to pay Peter back for calling him a beast. As for what the witch would do with the others, he didn't want her to be particularly nice to them, certainly not to put them on the same level as himself. But he managed to believe or to pretend he believed that she wouldn't do anything very bad to them. Because, he said to himself, all these people who say nasty things about her are her enemies, and probably half of it isn't true. She was jolly nice to me anyway, much nicer than they are. I expect she is the rightful queen, really. Anyway, she'll be better than that awful Aslan. At least that's what the excuse he made in his own mind for what he was doing. It wasn't a very good excuse, however, for deep down inside he really knew that the White Witch was bad and cruel. The first thing he realized when he got outside and found the snow falling around him was that he had left his coat behind in the beaver's house. And of course, there was no chance of going back to get it now. The next thing he realized, that daylight was almost gone, for it had been nearly 3 o'clock when they sat down to dinner, and the winter days were short. He hadn't reckoned on this, but he had to make the best of it, so he turned up his collar and shuffled across the top of the dam. Luckily, it wasn't so slippery since the snow had fallen, to the far side of the river. It was pretty bad when he reached the far side. It was growing darker every minute. And what with that and the snowflakes swirling all around him, he could hardly see 3 feet ahead. And then, too, there was no road. He kept slipping into deep drifts of snow and skidding on frozen puddles and tripping over fallen tree trunks and sliding down steep banks and barking his shins against rocks till he was wet and cold and bruised all over. The silence and the loneliness were dreadful. In fact, I really think he mightn't have given up the whole plan and gone back and owned up and made friends with the others if he hadn't happened to say to himself, when I'm king of Narnia, the first thing I shall do will be to make some decent roads. And of course that set him off thinking about being a king, and all the things he would do, and all this cheered him up a good deal. He had just settled in his mind what sort of place he would have, and how many cars, and about all his private cinema, and where the principal railways would run, and what laws he would make against beavers and dams, and was putting the finishing touches to some schemes for keeping Peter in his place, when the weather changed. First the snow stopped, then the wind sprang up, and it became freezing cold. Finally the clouds rolled away, and the moon came out. It was a full moon, and shining on all that snow, it made everything almost bright as day, only the shadows were rather confusing. He would never have found his way if the moon hadn't come out by the time he had got to the other river. You remember he had seen, when they had first arrived at the beavers, a smaller river floating into the great one lower down. He now reached this and turned to follow it up, but the little valley down which it came up was much steeper and rockier than the one he had just left, and much overgrown with bushes, so that he could not have managed it all in the dark. Even as it was, he got wet. Hold on. There's a break. So I'm just hearing noises outside the room slightly. Even as it was, he got wet through, for he had to stoop under branches, and great loads of snow came sliding off onto his back. Every time this happened, he thought more and more how he hated Peter, just as if he had this been Peter's fault. But at last he came to a part where it was more level and the valley opened out. And there, on the other side of the river, quite close to him, in the middle of a little plain between 2 hills, he saw what must be the White Witch's house. And the moon was shining brighter than ever. The The house was really a small castle. It seemed to be all towers, little towers with long pointed spires on them, sharp as needles. They looked like huge dancers' caps or sorcerers' caps, dunces' caps or sorcerers' caps. And they shone in the moonlight, and their long shadows looked strange on the snow. Edmund began to be afraid of the house. But it was too late to think of turning back now. He crossed the river on the ice and walked up to the house. There was nothing stirring, not the slightest sound anywhere. Even his own feet made no sound on the deep, newly fallen snow. He walked on, past corner after corner of the house, and past turret after turret to find the door. He had to go right round to the far side, before he found it. It was a huge arch with a great... I'm like... It was a huge... One second. Pausing for a moment. Sorry about that. Put some covers on my ears. Hopefully that helps. Benton began to be afraid of the house. But it's too late to think of turning back now. He crossed the river on the ice and walked up to the house. There was nothing stirring, not the slightest sound anywhere. Even his own feet made no noise on the deep, newly fallen snow. He walked on, past corner after corner of the house, past turret after turret to find the door. He had to go right round to the far side before he found it. It was a huge arch, but the great iron gate stood wide open. Edmund crept up to the arch and looked inside into the courtyard, and there he saw the sight that nearly made his heart stop beating. Just inside the gate, with the moonlight shining on it, stood an enormous lion, crouched as if it was ready to spring. And Edmund stood in the shadow of the arch, afraid to go on, afraid to go back, with his knees knocking together. He stood there so long that his teeth would have been chattering with cold, even if they had not been chattering with fear. How long this really lasted, I don't know, but it seemed to Edmund to last for hours. Then, at last, he began to wonder why the lion was standing so still, for it hadn't moved 1 inch since he first set eyes on it. Edmund now ventured a little nearer, still keeping in the shadows of the arch as much as he could. He now saw from the way the lion was standing that it couldn't have been looking at him at all. But supposing that it turns its head, thought Edmund. In fact, it was staring at something else, namely a little dwarf who stood with his back to it, about 4 feet away. Aha, thought Edmund. When it springs at the dwarf, then it will be my chance to escape. But the lion never moved, nor did the dwarf. Now at last Edmund remembered what the others had said about the White Witch turning people into stone. Perhaps this was only a stone lion. As soon as he had thought of that, he noticed the lion's back and the top of its head were covered with snow. Of course, it must only be a statue. No living animal would have let itself get covered with snow. Then, very slowly, and with his heart beating as if it would burst, Edmund ventured to go up to the lion. Even now, he hardly dared touch it, but at last he put out his hand, very quickly, and did. It was cold and stone. He had been frightened of a mere statue. The relief which Edmund felt was so great that in spite of the cold, he suddenly got warm all over, right down to his toes, and at the same time there came in his head what seemed a perfectly lovely idea. Probably, he thought, this is the great lion Aslan that they were all talking about. She's caught him already and turned him into stone, so that's the end of all their fine ideas about him. Pooh, who's afraid of Aslan? And he stood there, gloating over the stone lion, and presently he did something very silly and childish. He took a stump of lead pencil out of his pocket and scribbled a mustache on the lion's upper lip, and then a pair of spectacles on its eyes. Then he said, "Yeah, silly old Aslan, how do you like being a stone? You thought yourself mighty fine, didn't you?" But in spite of the scribbles on the face of the great stone beast still looked so terrible, and sad, and noble, staring up into the moonlight, that Edmund didn't really get any fun out of jeering at it. He turned away and began to cross the courtyard. As he got into the middle of it, he saw that there were dozens of statues all about, standing here and there, rather as the pieces stand on a chessboard when it is halfway through the game. There were stone satyrs, and stone wolves, and bears and foxes, and cat and mountains of stone. There were lovely stone shapes that looked like women, but were really the spirit of trees. There were the great shapes of centaurs, and a winged horse, and a long, lithe creature that Edmund took to be a dragon. They all looked so strange, standing there perfectly lifelike and also perfectly still in the bright, cold moonlight, that it was eerie work crossing the courtyard. Right in the very middle stood a huge shape like a man, but as tall as a tree, with a fierce face and a shaggy beard, and a great club in its right hand. Even though he knew it was only a stone giant and not a live one, Edmund did not like going past it. He now saw that there was a dim light showing from above the doorway on the far side of the courtyard. He went to it. There was a flight of stone steps growing up from an open door. Edmund went up them. Across the threshold lay a great wolf. It's all right, he kept saying to himself. It's only a stone wolf. It can't hurt me. Then he raised his leg to step over it. Instantly, the huge creature rose, with all the hair bristling along its back, opened a great red mouth, and said in a growling voice, "Who's there? Who's there? Stand still, stranger, and tell me who you are." And we're gonna pause because ads. And pull out the other room. I do have to ask Kiro, has the ads actually started? I'm gonna take a break and drink something, and then continue. I hope everyone's having a good evening. I think we're almost halfway through the book already, my goodness. Maybe not, maybe a third. Yeah, we're about a third of the way through. Almost half. Dropped. I didn't remember these books being this short. I don't think so. I just didn't remember them being this short. I think they were honestly intended to be shorter books for kids to read, which makes sense. You know, young adults. Anyway, back to the weird Sleeping Beauty thing. From time to time, the king's sons came determined to wake her, but they were so frightened at the sight of that thorny hedge that they turned and fled. And the faster they ran, the longer were the arms of the hedge and thorns reached out to seize and destroy them. One and all, they were destroyed while Briar Rose slept on. At last, after many, many years, there came to the land a certain king's son, to whom an old man told the tale of the princess. He told the king's son how sadly the other king's sons had fared, and who tried to do battle with the hedge. But this youth said, "I'm not afraid of the hedge, and I shall go and awaken the beautiful princess." The old man did all he could to dissuade the prince. Why would you tell him the story if you... Sorry. Here's this princess, by the way. I'm gonna go do it. No, don't do it. Dissuade the prince from going, but the youth would not listen to his words. Off he set towards the frozen castle. As he drew near, he felt its icy breath. He saw the snow. Is this all thematic? Snow over all, and the great thorn hedge that rose threateningly above him. But he was not afraid of that hedge, as the other king's sons had been. Confidently he strode towards it, and when he faced it squarely, with such utter lack of fear, it suddenly turned green, blossomed with beautiful flowers, and parted its own accord to let him pass. Then the snow stopped falling, and the ice melted. But by the time he reached the castle yard, all signs of winter had fled. The earth was in bloom about him, but the horses and dogs were still asleep. The pigeons on the rooftop still had their heads buried under their wings, and when he entered the castle, the flies were still asleep on the wall. The fire slept in its hearth, and the cook was still holding out her hand as though to cuff the scullery boy. Within the great hall, the king and queen lay asleep on their thrones, with their whole court sleeping about them. All was so quiet everywhere that a breath could have been heard. At last the king's son came to the stone tower with the narrow stair that went winding upwards. Up the rickety steps he climbed and opened the door to the little chamber. There, before him on the bed, lay Briar Rose asleep. Her cheeks were faintly flushed, her hair like gold, and her clothes were all quaint and old-fashioned, like those his great-great-grandmother had worn. So beautiful was she that the king's son could not turn his eyes from her. As he looked, he stooped down and gently gave her a kiss. Again, remember, people, don't do this. This is not consent. The moment she felt his kiss, Briar Rose opened her eyes and awoke. Then she looked at him sweetly and slowly rose from her crouch. Hand in hand, down the stairs together they went. When they entered the great hall of the castle, the king awoke, and the queen, and the whole court, and all looked at each other astonished. The horses in the courtyard stood up and shook themselves. The dogs jumped up and wagged their tails. The pigeons on the roof awoke and flew away into open country. The flies on the wall crept again, and the fire on the kitchen hearth flickered and flamed up. The great iron kettle began to boil, and the cook soundly boxed the ears of the scullery boy. The very next day, the marriage of the king's son with the Briar Rose was celebrating with all rejoicing, and inside the castle and out was the life and bloom of the spring. Wow, that's literally the last. That's the end of that one. Timing. So the wolf awoke and growled at him. "If you please, sir," said Edmund, trembling so that he could hardly speak. Oh, I should probably press this button. There. "My name is Edmund. I'm the son of Adam that Her Majesty met in the woods the other day. I've come to bring her the news that my brother and sisters are now in Narnia, quite close in the beaver's house. She wanted to see them." "I will tell Her Majesty," said the wolf. "Meanwhile, stand still on the threshold, as you value your life." Then it vanished into the house. Edmund stood and waited, his fingers aching with cold and his heart pounding in his chest, and presently the great wolf, Malgrim, the chief of the witches' secret police, came bounding back and said, come in, fortunate favorite of the queen, or else not so fortunate." And Edmund went in, taking great care not to tread on the wolf's paws. He found himself in a long, gloomy hall with many pillars, full as the country yard had been of statues. The one nearest the door was a little faun with a very sad expression on his face, and Edmund couldn't help wondering if this might be Lucy's friend. The only light came from a single lamp, and close behind this sat the White Witch. "I've come, your majesty," said Edmund, rushing eagerly forwards. "How dare you come alone?" said the witch in a terrible voice. "Did I not tell you to bring the others with you?" "Please, your majesty," said Edmund, "I've done the best I can. I've brought them quite close. They're in the little house on top of the dam just up the river, with Mr. and Mrs. Beaver." A slow, cruel smile came over the witch's face. "Is this all your news?" she asked. "No, your majesty," said Edmund, and proceeded to tell her all that he had heard before leaving the beaver's house. "What? Aslan?" cried the queen. "Aslan, is this true? If I find you have been lying to me." "Please, I'm only repeating what they said," stammered Edmund. But the queen, who had no longer attending to him, clapped her hands. Instantly, the same dwarf whom Edmund had seen with her before appeared. "Make ready our sledge," ordered the queen, "and use the harness without bells." Chapter 10. The spell begins to break. Now we must go back to Mr. and Mrs. Beaver and the three other children. As soon as Mr. Beaver said, "There's no time to lose," everyone began bundling themselves into coats, except Mrs. Beaver, who started packing up sacks and laying them on the table, and said, "Now, Mr. Beaver, just reach down that ham, and here's a packet of tea, and there's sugar, and some matches, and if someone will get 2 or 3 loaves out of the crock over there on the counter." What are you doing, Mrs. Beaver?" exclaimed Susan. "Packing a loaf for each of us, dearie," said Mrs. Beaver very coolly. "You don't think we'd set on a journey with nothing to eat, would you?" "But we haven't the time," said Susan, buttoning the collar of her coat. "She may be here any minute." "That's what I say," chimed in Mr. Beaver. "Get along with you all," said his wife. "Think it over, Mr. Beaver. She can't be here for a quarter of an hour at least." "But don't we want as big a start as we can possibly get?" said Peter. "If we're to reach the stone table before her." "You've got to remember that, Mrs. Beaver," said Susan. "As soon as she has looked in here and finds we're gone, she'll be off at top speed." "That she will," said Mrs. Beaver, "but we can't get there before her, whatever we do, for she'll be on the sledge and we'll be walking." "Then we have no hope," said Susan. "Now don't you get fussing there, dear," said Mrs. Beaver. "We just get half a dozen clean handkerchiefs out of the drawer. Of course we've got a hope. We can't get there before her, but we can keep up under cover and go by ways she won't expect, and perhaps we'll get through." "That's true enough, Mrs. Beaver," said her husband, "but it's time we were out of this." "And don't you start fussing either, Mr. Beaver," said his wife. "There, that's better. There's 5 loaves, and the smallest for the smallest of us. That's you, my dear," she added, looking at Lucy. "Well, I'm nearly ready now," answered Miss... said his wife. Sorry, they broke the sentence. "Well, I'm nearly ready now," answered Mrs. Beaver at last, allowing her husband to help her into his snow boots. "I suppose the sewing machine's too heavy to bring?" "Yes, it is," said Mr. Beaver. "A great deal too heavy. And if you don't think you'll be able to use it well... And you don't think you'll be able to use it while we're on the run, I suppose?" "I can't abide the thought of that witch fiddling with it," said Mrs. Beaver, "and breaking it or stealing it as likely as not." "Oh, please, please, please do hurry," said the 3 children. And so at last they all got outside, and Mr. Beaver locked the door. "It'll delay her a bit," he said, and they set off, all carrying their loads over their shoulders. The snow had stopped, and the moon had come out when they had begun their journey. So that would be about... So they're leaving the moment the witch is hearing from Edmund. I like that little note for us to tell when it's happening. They all went in single file. First Mr. Beaver, then Lucy, then Peter, then Susan, and Mrs. Beaver last of all. Mr. Beaver led them across the dam and onto the right bank of the river, and then along a very rough, short path among the trees right down by the river bank. The sides of the valley, shining in the moonlight, towered up far above them on either side. "Best keep down here as much as possible," he said. "She'll have to keep to the tops, for you couldn't bring a sledge down here." It would have been a pretty enough scene to look at through a window from a comfortable armchair. And even as things were, Lucy enjoyed it at first. But as they went on, walking and walking and walking, and as the sack she had carried felt heavier and heavier, she began to wonder how she was going to keep up at all. And she stopped looking at the dazzling brightness of the frozen river with all its waterfalls of ice, and the white masses of the treetops, and the great glaring moon, and the countless stars, and could only watch the little short legs of Mr. Beaver going pad, 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 pad through the snow in front of her, as if they were never going to stop. Then the moon disappeared, and the snow began to fall once more. And at last Lucy was so tired that she was almost asleep and walking at the same time, when she suddenly found that Mr. Beaver had turned away from the river bank to the right and was leading them steeply uphill into the very thickest bushes. And then, as she came fully awake, she found that Mr. Beaver was just vanishing into a little hole in the bank, which had been almost hidden under the bushes until you were quite on top of it. In fact, by the time she realized what was happening, only his short, flat tail was showing. Lucy immediately stooped down and crawled in after him. Then she heard noises of scrambling and puffing and panting behind her, and in a moment all 5 of them were inside. "Wherever is this?" said Peter's voice, sounding tired and pale in the darkness. I hope you know that I mean by a voice sounding pale. Sorry, distracted. "It's an old hiding place for beavers in bad times," said Mr. Beaver, "and a great secret. It's not much of a place, but we must get a few hours' sleep." "If you hadn't been in such a plaguey fuss when we were starting, I'd have brought some pillows," said Mrs. Beaver. It wasn't nearly such a nice cave as Mr. Tumnus's, Lucy thought. Just a hole in the ground, but dry and earthy. It was very small, that when they all laid down, they were all a bundle of clothes together. And what with that and being warmed up by their long walk, they were really rather snug. If only the floor of the cave was been a little smoother. Then Mrs. Beaver handed round in the dark a little flask out of which everyone drank something. It made one cough and sputter a little and stung the throat, but it also made you feel deliciously warm after you swallowed, and everyone went straight to sleep. She fucking gave them alcohol. I'm sorry. It seemed to Lucy only the next minute, though really it was hours and hours later, when she woke up feeling a little cold and dreadfully stiff, thinking how she would like a hot bath. Then she felt a set of long whiskers tickling her cheek, and saw the cold daylight coming in through the mouth of the cave. But immediately after that she was very wide awake indeed, and so was everyone else. In fact, they were all sitting up with their mouths and eyes wide open, listening to a sound which was the very sound they'd all been thinking of, and sometimes imagining they heard during their walks last night. It was a sound of jingling bells. Mr. Beaver was out of the cave like a flash the moment he heard it. Perhaps you think, as Lucy thought for a moment, that this was a very silly thing to do, but it was a very really sensible one. He knew he could scramble over the top of the bank among the bushes and brambles without being seen, and he wanted above all things to see which way the witch's sledge went. The others all sat in the cave waiting and wondering. They waited nearly 5 minutes. Then they heard something that frightened them very much. They heard voices. "Oh," thought Lucy, "he's been seen. She's caught him." Great was their surprise when a little later they heard Mr. Beaver's voice calling to them from just outside the cave. "It's all right," he was shouting. "Come out, Mrs. Beaver. Come out, sons and daughters of Adam. It's all right. It isn't her." This was bad grammar, of course, but that's how beavers talk when they are excited. I mean, in Narnia. In our world, they usually don't talk at all. So Mrs. Beaver and the children came bundling out of the cave, and blinking in the daylight, and with earth all over them, and looking very frowsty and unbrushed and uncombed, and with a sleep in their eyes. "Come on," cried Mr. Beaver, who was almost dancing with delight. "Come and see. This is nearly knock for the witch. This is a nasty knock for the witch. Oh, sorry. It looks as if her power is already crumbling." What do you mean, Mr. Beaver?" panted Peter as they all scrambled up the steep bank of the valley together. "Didn't I tell you," answered Mr. Beaver, "that she'd make it always winter and never Christmas? Didn't I tell you? Well, just come and see." And then they were all at the top and did see. It was a sledge. And it was a reindeer, with bells on their harness. But they were far bigger than the witch's reindeer. They were not white and brown, but brown. And on the sledge sat a person whom everyone knew the moment they set eyes on him. He was a huge man in a bright red robe, bright as holly berries, with a hood that had fur inside it, and a great white beard that fell like a foamy waterfall over his chest. Everyone knew him because though you see people of his sort only in Narnia, you see pictures of them and hear them talked about even in our world. The world on this side of the wardrobe door. But when you really see them in Narnia, it is rather different. Some of the pictures of Father Christmas in our world make him look only funny and jolly. But now that the children actually stood looking at him, they didn't find it quite like that. He was so big and so glad and so real that they all became quite still. They felt very glad, but also solemn. "I've come at last," said he. "She has kept me out for a long time, but I have got it in at last. Aslan is on the move. The witch's magic is weakening." And Lucy felt running through her that deep shiver of gladness which you only get when you're being solemn and still. "And now," said Father Christmas, "for your presents. There is a new and better sewing machine for you, Mrs. Beaver. I will drop it in your house as I pass." "If you please, sir," said Mrs. Beaver, making a curtsy. "It's locked up." "Locks and bolts make no difference to me," said Father Christmas, "and for you, Mr. Beaver, When you get home, you will find your dam finished and mended, and all the leaks stopped and a new sluice gate fitted. Mr. Beaver was so pleased that he opened his mouth very wide and then found he couldn't say anything at all. Peter, Adam's son, said Father Christmas. Here, sir, said Peter. These are your presents, was the answer. They are tools, not toys. It is time to use them. Sorry, the time to use them is... Whoa, my eyes got weird. I was like... I don't know why, I went a little cross-eyed there. The time to use them is perhaps near at hand. Bear them well. With these words, he handed to Peter a shield and a sword. The shield was the color of silver, and across it there ramped a red lion, as bright and as a ripe strawberry. At the moment when... Oh my gosh, I can do this. The shield was the color of silver, and across it there ramped a red lion, as bright and as ripe a strawberry as the moment when you pick it. The hilt of the sword was of gold, and it had sheathed and... Why can't I read? The hilt of the sword was of gold, and it had a sheath and a sword belt and everything it needed. And it was just the right size and weight for Peter to use. Peter was silent and solemn as he received these gifts, for he felt they were a very serious kind of present. Susan, Eve's daughter, said Father Christmas, these are for you. And he handed her a bow and a quiver full of arrows and a little ivory horn. You must use the bow only in great need, he said, for I do not mean you to fight in the battle. It does not easily miss. And when you put this horn to your lips and blow it, then, wherever you are, I think help of some kind will come to you. Last of all, he said, Lucy, Eve's daughter. And Lucy came forward. He gave her a little bottle of what looked like glass, but people said afterwards that it was made of diamond, and a small dagger. In this bottle, he said, there is a cordial made of the juice of one of the fire flowers that grows in the mountains of the sun. If you or any of your friends is hurt, a few drops of this will restore them, and the dagger is to defend yourself at great need, for you are also not to be in the battle. Why, sir, said Lucy, I don't know, but I think I could be brave enough. That is not the point, he said, but battles are ugly when women fight. Battles are ugly when women fight. Offense, and whatever. And now, he said, suddenly looking less grave, here is something for the moment. Here is something for the moment for you all. And he brought out, I suppose from the big bag at his back, but nobody quite saw him do it, a large tray containing 5 cups and saucers, a bowl of lump sugar, a jug of cream, and a great big teapot, all sizzling and piping hot. Then he cried out, Merry Christmas, long live the true king. And he cracked his whip, and he and the reindeer and the sledge were all out of sight before anyone realized that they had started. Peter had just drawn his sword out of its sheath and was showing it to Mr. Beaver when Mrs. Beaver said, Now then, don't stand there talking there till the tea's gone cold. Just like men, come and help carry the tray down and we'll have breakfast. What a mercy, I thought of bringing the bread knife. So down the steep bank they went and back to the cave. And Mr. Beaver cut some of the bread and ham into sandwiches, and Mrs. Beaver poured out the tea, and everyone enjoyed themselves. But long before they had finished enjoying themselves, Mr. Beaver said, Time we be moving on now. Chapter 11. Aslan is near. Edmund, meanwhile, had been having a most disappointing time. When the dwarf had gone to get the sledge ready, he expected that the witch would start being nice to him, as she had been at their last meeting, but she said nothing at all. When at last Edmund plucked up his courage to say, Please, your majesty, could I have some Turkish delight? You said, she answered, Silence, fool. Then she appeared to change her mind and said, as if to herself, And yet it will not do to have the brat fainting on the way. And once more clapped her hands. Another dwarf appeared. Bring the human creature food and drink, she said. The dwarf went away and presently returned bringing an iron bowl with some water in it and an iron plate with a hunk of dry bread on it. He grinned in a repulsive manner and set them down on the floor beside Edmund and said, Turkish delight for the little prince, ha ha ha. Take it away, said Edmund sulkily. I don't want dry bread. But the witch suddenly turned on him, and such a terrible expression on her face that he apologized and began to nibble at the bread, though it was so stale he could hardly get it down. "You may be glad enough of it before you taste bread again," said the witch. While he was still chewing away, the first dwarf came back and announced the sledge was ready. The White Witch rose and went out, ordering Edmund to go with her. The snow was again falling as they came into the courtyard, but she took no notice of that and made Edmund sit beside her on the sledge. But before they drove off, she called Malgrim, and he came bounding like an enormous dog to the side of the sledge. "Take with you the swiftest of your wolves, and go at once to the house of the beavers," said the witch, "and kill whatever you find there. If they are already gone, then make it all speed to the stone table, but do not be seen. Wait for me there in hiding. I, meanwhile, must go many miles to the west before I find a place where I can drive across the river. You may overtake these humans before they reach the stone table. You will know what to do if you find them." "I hear and obey, O great queen," growled the wolf, and immediately he shot away into the snow and darkness, as quickly as a horse can gallop. In a few minutes he had called another wolf, and with him down on the dam, sniffing at the beaver's house. He had called another wolf and was with him down on the dam, sniffing at the beaver's house. But of course they found it empty. It would have been a dreadful thing for the beavers and the children if the night had remained fine, but the wolves would then have been able to follow their trail, and 10 to 1 would have overtaken them before they had got to the cave. But now that the snow had begun again, the scent was cold, and even their footprints were covering up. Meanwhile, the dwarf whipped up the reindeer, and the witch and Edmund drove out under the archway and on away into the darkness and the cold. This was a terrible journey for Edmund, who had no coat. Before they had gone a quarter of an hour, all the front of him had been covered with snow. He soon stopped trying to shake it off because, as quickly as he did that, a new lot gathered, and he was so tired. Soon he was wet to the skin, and oh, how miserable he was. He didn't look now as if the witch intended to make him a king. All the things he had said to make himself believe she was good and kind, and that her side was really the right side, sounded to him silly now. He would have given anything to meet the others at this moment, even Peter. The only way to comfort himself now was to try and believe that the whole thing was a dream, and that he might wake up any moment. And as they went on, hour after hour, it did come to seem like a dream. This lasted longer than I could describe, even if I wrote pages and pages about it, but I will skip on to the time when the snow had stopped and the morning had come, and they were racing along in the daylight. And still they went on, with no sound but the everlasting swish of the snow and the creaking of the reindeer's harness. And then, at last, the witch said, "What have we here? Stop." And they did. How Edmund hoped that she was going to say something about breakfast, but she had stopped for quite a different reason. A little ways off, at the foot of a tree, sat a merry party. A squirrel and his wife, with their children, and 2 satyrs and a dwarf, and an old dog fox, all stood round a table. Edmund couldn't quite see what they were eating, but it smelled lovely, and there seemed to be decorations of holly. He wasn't at all sure that he didn't see something like plum pudding. At the moment when the sledge stopped, the fox, who was obviously the oldest person present, had just risen to his feet, holding a glass in his right paw, as he was going to say something. But when the whole party saw the sledge stopping, and who was in it, all the gaiety went out of their faces. The father squirrel stopped eating with his fork halfway to his mouth, and one of the satyrs stopped with his fork actually in its mouth, and the baby squirrel squeaked with terror. "What is the meaning of this?" asked the witch queen. Nobody answered. "Speak, vermin," she said again, "or do you want my dwarf to find you a tongue with his whip? What is the meaning of all this gluttony, this waste, this self-indulgence? Where did you get all these things?" "Please, your majesty," said the fox, "we were given them, and if I might be so bold as to drink your majesty's very good health." "Who gave them to you?" said the witch. "Father Christmas," stammered the fox. "What?" roared the witch, springing from the sledge and taking a few strides nearer the terrified animals. He has not been here. He cannot have been here. How dare you? But no. Say you have been lying, and you shall even now be forgiven. At this moment, one of the young squirrels lost its head completely. He has, it squeaked, beating its little spoon on the table. Edmund saw the witch bite her lips so that a drop of blood appeared on her white cheek. Then she raised her wand. Oh, don't, please, don't, shouted Edmund. But even while he was shouting, she waved her wand, and instantly, where the merry party had been, there were only statues of creatures. One with its fork fixed forever halfway to its stone mouth, seated around a stone table, on which there were stone plates and stone plum pudding. As for you, said the witch, giving Edmund a stunning blow to the face as she remounted the sledge, let that teach you to ask favor for spies and traitors. Drive on. And Edmund, for the first time in the story, felt sorry for someone besides himself. It seemed so pitiful to think of those little stone figures sitting there all the silent days and all the dark nights, year after year, till the moss grew on them, and at last even their faces crumbled away. Now they were steadily racing on again, and soon Edmund noticed that the snow was splashed against them. What? Against. Sorry. Now they were steadily racing on again, and soon Edmund noticed that the snow which splashed against them as they rushed through, it was much wetter than it had been last night. At the same time, he noticed that he was feeling much less cold. It was also becoming foggy. In fact, every minute it grew foggier and warmer. And the sledge was not running nearly as well as it had been running up till now. At first he thought this was because the reindeer were tired, but soon he saw that he couldn't be the real reason. The sledge jerked and skidded and kept on jolting as if it had struck against stones. And however the dwarf whipped the poor reindeer, the sledge went slower and slower. There also seemed to be a curious noise all around them, but the noise of the driving and jolting and the dwarfs shouting and the reindeer prevented Edmund from hearing what it was, until suddenly the sledge struck so fast that it couldn't go at all. When that happened, there was a moment's silence, and in that silence, Edmund could at last listen to the other noise properly. A strange, sweet, rustling, chattering noise, and yet not so strange, for he had heard it before, if only he could remember where. Then all at once he did remember. It was the noise of running water. All around them, throughout, though out of sight, there were streams, chattering, murmuring, bubbling, splashing, and even in the distance roaring, and his heart gave a great leap, though he hardly knew why, when he realized that the frost was over. And much nearer there was a drip, drip, drip from the branches of all the trees, and then, as he looked at one tree and saw a great load of snow slide off it, and for the first time since he had entered Narnia, he saw the dark green of a fir tree. But he hadn't time to listen or to watch any longer, for the witch said, "Don't sit staring, fool. Get out and help." Of course, Edmund had to obey. He stepped out into the snow, but it was really only slush by now, and began helping the dwarf to get the sledge out of the muddy hole it had got into. They got it out in the end, and by being very cruel to the reindeer, the dwarf managed to get it on the move again. And they drove a little further, and now the snow was really melting in earnest, and patches of green grass were beginning to appear in every direction. Unless you have looked at a world of snow as long as Edmund had been looking at, you would hardly be able to imagine what a relief those green patches were after the endless white. Then the sledge stopped again. "It's no good, your majesty," said the dwarf. "We can't sledge in this thaw." "Then we must walk," said the witch. "We shall never overtake them walking," growled the dwarf. "Not with the start they've got." "Are you my counselor or my slave?" said the witch. "Do as you're told. Tie the hands of the human creature behind it, and keep hold of the end of the rope, and take your whip. Cut the harness of the reindeer. They'll find their own way home." The dwarf obeyed, and in a few minutes Edmund found himself being forced to walk as fast as he could with his hands tied behind him. He kept on slipping in the slush and mud and wet grass, and every time he slipped, the dwarf gave him a curse and sometimes a flick with a whip. The witch walked behind the dwarf and kept on saying, "Faster, faster." Every moment the patches of green grew bigger and the patches of snow grew smaller. Every moment more and more of the trees shook off their robes of snow. Soon, Wherever you looked, instead of white shapes, you saw the dark green of firs or the black, prickly branches of bare oaks and beeches and elms. Then the mist turned from white to gold and presently cleared away altogether. Shafts of delicious sunlight struck down on the forest floor, and overhead you could see a blue sky between the treetops. Soon there were more wonderful things happening. Coming suddenly around a corner into a glade of silver birch trees, Edmund saw the ground covered in all directions with little yellow flowers. Celandines? The noise of water grew louder. Presently they actually crossed a stream. Beyond it they found snowdrops growing. "Mind your own business," said the dwarf when he saw that Edmund had turned his head to look at them, and he gave the rope a vicious jerk. But of course this didn't prevent Edmund from seeing. Only 5 minutes later he noticed a dozen crocuses growing round the foot of an old tree, gold and purple and white. Then came the sound of even more delicious than the sound of water. Close beside the path they were following, a bird suddenly chirped from a branch of a tree. It was answered by the chuckle of another bird a little further on. And then, as if that had been a signal, there was chattering and chirping in every direction, and then a moment of full song. And within 5 minutes the whole wood was ringing with birds' music. And wherever Edmund's eyes turned, he saw birds alighting on branches, or sailing overhead, or chasing one another, or having their little quarrels, or tidying up their feathers with their beaks. "Faster, faster," said the witch. There was no trace of the fog now. The sky became bluer and bluer, and now there were white clouds hurrying across it from time to time. In the wide glades there were primroses. A light breeze sprang up, which scattered drops of moisture from the swaying branches and carried cool, delicious scents against the faces of the travelers. The trees began to come fully alive. The larches and birches were covered with green, the laburnums with gold. Soon the beech trees had put forth their delicate, transparent leaves, and the travelers walked under them. The light had also become green. A bee buzzed across their path. "This is no thaw," said the dwarf, suddenly stopping. "This is spring. What are we to do? Your winter has been destroyed, I tell you. This is Aslan's doing." "If either of you mention that name again," said the witch, "he shall instantly be killed." Chapter 12. Peter's First Battle. While the dwarf and the witch were saying this, miles away, the beavers and the children were walking one hour after an hour into what seemed a delicious stream. Long ago they had left their coats behind them, and by now they had even stopped saying to one another, "Look, there's a kingfisher," or "I see the bluebells," or "What's that lovely smell?" or "Just listen to that thrush." They walked on in silence, drinking it all in, passing through patches of warm sunlight into cool green thickets and out again into wide mossy glades where tall elms raised their leafy roofs far overhead, and then into dense masses of flowering currants and among hawthorn bushes where the sweet smell was almost overpowering. They had been just as surprised as Edmund when they saw the winter vanishing and the whole wood passing in a few hours or so from January to May. They hadn't even known for certain, and the witch did, that this was what would happen when Aslan came to Narnia. But they all knew that it was her spell which was producing the endless winter, and therefore they all knew that this magic spring began that something had gone wrong, and badly wrong, with the witch's schemes. And after the thaw had been going on for more time, they all realized that the witch would no longer be able to use her sledge. And after that they didn't hurry so much, and they allowed themselves more rests and longer ones. They were pretty tired by now, of course, but not that I'd call bitterly tired, only slow and feeling very dreamy and quiet inside, as one does when one is coming to the end of a long day in the open. Susan had a slight blister on one heel. They had left the course of the big river some time ago, for one had to turn a little to the right, that meant a little to the south, to reach the place of the stone table. Even if this had not been the right way, they couldn't have kept to the river valley once the thaw began, for with all the melting snow, the river was soon in flood. A wonderful, roaring, thundering yellow flood, and their path would have been under water. And now the sun got low, and the light got redder, and the shadows got longer, and the flowers began to think about closing. Not now, said Mr. Beaver, and began leading them uphill across some very steep, springy moss. It felt nice under their tired feet. In a place, not long now. In a place where only tall trees grew, very wide apart. The climb, coming at the end of a long day, made them all pant and blow. Just as Lucy was wondering whether she could really get to the top without another long rest, suddenly they were at the top. And this is what they saw. They were on a green open space from which you could look down on the forest spreading as far as one could see in every direction, except right ahead. There, far to the east, was something twinkling and moving. "By gum," whispered Peter to Susan. "The sea!" In the very middle of the open hilltop was the stone table. It was a great grim slab of gray stone, supported on 4 upright stones. It looked very old. It was cut all over with strange lines and figures that might be the letters of an unknown language. They gave you a curious feeling when you looked at them. The next thing they saw was a pavilion pitched on one side of the open place. A wonderful pavilion it was, and especially now where the light of the setting sun fell upon it, with sides of what looked like yellow silk and cords of crimson and tent pegs of ivory, and high above it, on a pole, a banner which bore a red rampant line fluttering in the breeze, which was blowing in their faces from the far-off sea. While they were looking at this, they heard a sound of music on their right, and turning in that direction, they saw what they had come to see. Aslan stood in the center of a crowd of creatures who had grouped themselves round him in the shape of a half-moon. There were tree women there, and well women, dryads and naiads, as they used to be called in our world, who had stringed instruments. It was they who had made the music. There were 4 great centaurs. The horse part of them was like huge English farm horses, and the man part was like a stern but beautiful giant's. There was also a unicorn, and a bull with the head of a man, and a pelican, and an eagle, and a great dog. And next to Aslan stood 2 leopards, of whom one carried his crown, and the other his standard. But as for Aslan himself, the beavers and the children didn't know what to do or say when they saw him. People who have not been in Narnia sometimes think that a thing cannot be good and terrible at the same time. If the children had ever thought so, they were cured of it now, for when they tried to look at Aslan's face, they caught a glimpse of the golden mane and the great royal, solemn, overwhelming eyes, and then they found that they couldn't look at him and went all trembly. "Go on now," whispered Mr. Beaver. "No," whispered Peter, "you first." "No sons of Adam before animals. No, sons of Adam before animals," whispered Mr. Beaver back again. "Susan," whispered Peter, "what about you? Ladies first." "No, you're the eldest," whispered Susan, and of course, the longer they went on doing this, the more awkward they felt. Then at last Peter realized that it was up to him. He drew his sword and raised it to the salute, and hastily saying to the others, "Come on, pull yourselves together," he advanced to the lion and said, "We have come, Aslan." "Welcome, Peter, son of Adam," said Aslan. "Welcome, Susan." I'm gonna have to pause this for tonight. I actually can't do that voice now. My voice hurts. So we're gonna pause when Aslan speaks. I'm sorry. I hope everyone enjoyed the reading. I'm sorry to cut it in the middle there. I was hoping to get to the end of the chapter at least, but I realized trying to do that low voice, I actually just can't right now. Yeah, and besides, I think we're at 12 o'clock anyways. Almost, like 15 minutes. It's close enough. Yeah, let's see if we can find somebody quiet. Thank you. Are they loud?
They're not generally loud, but they're playing Phasmophobia.
There might be screaming.
You only have 1 viewer right now.
I only have 1 viewer?
Yeah.
Okay, well, okay, well, then they're probably awake. So, yeah, let's switch over to Phasmophobia, I guess.
Alright.
Thank you, everybody, for attending. And see you guys next week. Bye.